My name is Sarah. I am 32 years old, and I work as a corporate accounts payable manager. For my entire life, my family treated my birthday like an inconvenient afterthought, while my brother Bradley was celebrated like royalty. But 3 weeks ago, at his lavish $42,000 birthday gala, the final bill was brought to the head table. The credit card on file had declined. Bradley laughed and slid the leather folder over to me, telling the room that I handle all the boring admin stuff. I did not reach for my purse. I slid the bill right back to him and told him to look closely at the name on that declined card. Then I suggested he call his lawyer. The entire ballroom went dead silent. Before I explain the absolute chaos that followed, and how I systematically dismantled my brother's perfect fake life, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Only do it if you genuinely enjoy stories about family justice. Also, drop a comment below, and let me know what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing where my listeners are from. Now let me take you directly into the center of that ballroom right before the trap snapped shut. The crystal chandeliers in the Grand Oak Country Club cast a warm, golden light over 80 of the most pretentious guests you could ever meet. It was a formal black tie affair to celebrate my brother Bradley turning 30. Everything in the room was excessively expensive and entirely unnecessary. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of vintage champagne. A massive hand-carved ice sculpture of a luxury sports car was slowly melting near the raw bar, dripping cold water into a crystal basin. The floral arrangements on each table were towering cascades of white orchids and imported roses. I sat at the very edge of the head table wearing a simple navy dress I bought on sale 3 years ago. I felt entirely out of place, which was exactly how my family wanted me to feel. Across from me sat my brother's wife, Chloe. Chloe was wearing a custom sequined gown that probably cost more than my car. She was leaning over the table aggressively, boasting to her wealthy parents about Bradley's massive success as an entrepreneur. She talked endlessly about his business vision, his upcoming tech launch, and the luxury lifestyle they were building together. My mother, Susan, sat next to Chloe. She was nodding along with absolute adoration in her eyes, hanging onto every single word her daughter-in-law said. My father, Richard, was busy pouring premium scotch for Chloe's father. He was laughing loudly at jokes that were not funny, desperate to secure the approval of his wealthy in-laws. And then there was Bradley. He sat in the center of it all, soaking up the attention like a dry sponge. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo and a heavy gold watch that caught the light every time he raised his glass for another toast. Nobody at that table mentioned that Bradley's last 3 business ventures had completely failed. Nobody mentioned that my parents had remortgaged their future to bail him out time and time again. And nobody mentioned that today was also my birthday. Yes, Bradley and I share a birth month. We were born exactly 2 years and 4 days apart. But in our family, only one of us truly mattered. I was the reliable one, the boring one, the corporate accounts payable manager who lived in a modest apartment and worked 50 hours a week. I was the invisible workhorse they only called when a bill needed paying or a mess needed cleaning. I was expected to sit quietly in the background and applaud my brother's manufactured success. "Sarah, be a dear and wave down a waiter," my mother snapped at me, not even looking in my direction. "Chloe's glass is empty, and you are closest to the aisle." I looked at my mother. I looked at Chloe, who was ignoring me completely to show her mother photos of their new luxury-leased sport utility vehicle. I did not wave down a waiter. I simply took a sip of my water and placed the glass back down on the linen tablecloth. My mother frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line of severe annoyance. She was not used to me ignoring her commands. For 32 years, I had been the perfect, obedient daughter. I swallowed every insult. I absorbed every slight. I paid their property taxes when things got tight and organized their family gatherings without ever asking for a simple thank you. But tonight was completely different. Tonight, I was not here to serve them. I was here to watch a carefully constructed illusion completely shatter into a million pieces. I knew exactly what was about to happen because I had orchestrated every single detail from the shadows. I knew exactly how much the floral arrangements cost. I knew the price of the prime rib dinner being served on gold-rimmed plates. I knew the final tally was astronomical. And I knew the exact moment the venue director would realize that the money funding this entire charade did not actually exist. Bradley stood up and tapped his heavy silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The gentle ringing sound commanded the immediate attention of the room. He adjusted his silk bow tie and offered a blinding, practiced smile to his captive audience. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Bradley began, his voice dripping with false humility. "Reaching 30 is a major milestone. They say your 20s are for learning and your 30s are for earning." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd. Chloe's parents nodded in deep approval, raising their glasses to him. "I have to give a special thank you to my beautiful wife, Chloe," he continued, gesturing grandly toward her, "and to my incredible parents, Richard and Susan. You always believed in my vision. You always knew that my startup would change the landscape. We are on the verge of a massive breakthrough, and tonight is just the beginning of our legacy." He raised his glass high in the air. The room erupted into loud applause. My mother wiped a single proud tear from her cheek. My father patted Bradley heavily on the back, his chest puffed out with pride. I sat completely still, my hands folded perfectly in my lap. I watched him lie to 80 people without blinking an eye. He spoke passionately about his legacy, but he did not mention that his legacy was currently being funded by stolen money. He did not mention the forged documents or the home equity line of credit taken out illegally against my name. He did not mention me at all. I was just a background character in his movie. I was the convenient scapegoat meant to absorb his debts, while he took all the credit and the glory. Chloe leaned over to me while the room was still clapping. Her breath smelled of expensive champagne and pure entitlement. "You should really take notes, Sarah," Chloe sneered, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Maybe if you took some actual risks like Brad, you would not be stuck balancing boring spreadsheets for the rest of your life. It must be so depressing to just watch other people succeed while you do nothing." I turned my head and looked directly into her eyes. I did not shrink away. I did not look down at my lap the way the old Sarah would have done just a few months ago. I smiled. It was a calm, terrifyingly peaceful smile. "You are absolutely right, Chloe," I said smoothly. "Balancing spreadsheets teaches you a lot about risk. It teaches you that eventually every single debt has to be reconciled. The numbers always catch up to you in the end." Chloe blinked, clearly unsettled by my calm tone. She opened her mouth to deliver another sharp insult, but she was suddenly interrupted. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open. The venue's event director, a tall man in a dark suit named Mr. Harrison, walked briskly into the room. He did not look happy. He held a black leather billfold tightly in his hands. He bypassed the circulating waiters and marched directly toward the head table. His pace was urgent, his face pale and tight with professional panic. I felt my heart rate steady. The moment had finally arrived. Mr. Harrison reached our table and stopped right behind Bradley's chair. He leaned down, whispering urgently into Bradley's ear. I could not hear the exact words, but I saw Bradley's confident smile falter for a fraction of a second. His shoulders tensed. Then Bradley quickly recovered, letting out a booming, dismissive laugh that echoed slightly over the quiet background music. "Oh, it is just a simple bank error," Bradley announced loudly, making sure Chloe's parents heard him clearly. "You know how these fraud alerts are when you make a large premium purchase. The bank gets overly cautious and blocks the transaction." Bradley took the leather billfold from Mr. Harrison. He did not even look at the receipt inside. Instead, with a theatrical sigh and a perfectly practiced roll of his eyes, he slid the heavy leather folder directly across the white linen tablecloth. It stopped right in front of my plate. "Sarah handles all the boring admin stuff for the family," Bradley joked to the crowd, waving his hand toward me like I was his personal assistant. "Be a dear and sort this out with the director, Sarah. Just put it on your backup card for tonight, and my finance team will reimburse you first thing on Monday morning." My mother immediately chimed in, her tone sharp and intensely impatient. "Honestly, Sarah, hurry up. Do not keep the poor man waiting. You are ruining the flow of the evening with your hesitation." The people seated nearest to us chuckled softly. They looked at me with mild pity, seeing exactly what my family wanted them to see. They saw the drab, obedient sister, who was there to clean up the administrative mess so the important, successful people could continue celebrating their flawless lives. I looked down at the dark leather billfold. I slowly opened it. The printed receipt inside was glaringly clear under the chandelier light. The total charge was $42,350. Stamped across the bottom in bold red ink was a single phrase. Declined. Code 04. Suspected fraud. I closed the billfold. I did not reach for my purse. I did not reach for my phone to check my accounts. I simply placed my hands flat on the table, took a slow, deep breath, and looked up at my brother. "I am not paying this bill, Brad," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried a cold, absolute finality that sliced directly through the ambient noise of the luxurious room. Bradley's smile completely froze. A murmur of genuine confusion rippled through the guests seated closest to us. Chloe's parents leaned forward in their chairs, their brows furrowing in sudden concern. "Sarah, stop playing games," Bradley hissed through gritted teeth, leaning aggressively across the table. The charming, wealthy facade was slipping rapidly, revealing the raw panic hiding underneath. "Just give the man your card right now. I said I will pay you back. Do not embarrass me in front of my investors and my family." My mother slammed her hand down hard on the table, her face flushing bright red with anger. "Sarah Elizabeth, you will open your purse right now and take care of this bill. How dare you act this selfish way at your brother's milestone celebration? You are causing a scene." "No, Mother," I replied, my gaze shifting steadily to her angry face. "I will not pay a single cent." I picked up the leather billfold and slid it straight back across the smooth tablecloth. It bumped lightly against Bradley's crystal water glass, making a sharp clinking sound. "You might want to read the name on that declined card, Brad," I said, leaning forward just enough to ensure the entire table heard every single word I spoke. "Because it is your name printed there, tied to your account. And then you might want to excuse yourself from this lovely party and call a very good criminal defense lawyer." The entire room dropped into a suffocating, dead silence. The string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing their instruments. The waiters froze in place, holding their silver trays perfectly still. 80 pairs of eyes darted nervously between me, my furious mother, and my suddenly pale, sweating brother. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with sudden fear. "Brad, what is she talking about? Just pay the stupid bill." Bradley slowly opened the folder. He stared down at the red declined stamp. He looked at the card number printed on the receipt. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost trapped inside a custom tuxedo. "The card declined," I announced to the silent watching room, "because the bank officially froze the account for felony bank fraud this morning. That $42,000 bill cannot be paid tonight because the stolen funds you were planning to use have been permanently seized by federal investigators." My father knocked over his heavy dining chair as he stood up in a sheer panic, his hands shaking violently at his sides. "Sarah, what have you done?" "I did exactly what an accounts payable manager does, Dad," I said, rising calmly and smoothly from my seat. "I audited the accounts. I found the forged signatures. And I reported the massive embezzlement to the authorities. To fully understand how my family ended up trapped in this ballroom with a massive bill they could not pay, and how I systematically orchestrated their absolute financial downfall, you need to understand the deep history of our toxic dynamic. You need to understand how completely they normalized using me as a human shield for their mistakes. Because this night was not just about a ruined birthday party. It was the explosive culmination of 32 years of emotional erasure, cruel gaslighting, and absolute financial betrayal. Let me take you back to the very beginning, to the exact moment I finally opened my eyes and realized that the people who were supposed to love me were secretly trying to destroy my entire future. To fully understand how my family ended up trapped in that ballroom with a massive bill they could not pay, and how I systematically orchestrated their absolute financial downfall, you need to understand the deep history of our toxic dynamic. You need to understand how completely they normalized using me as a human shield for their mistakes. Because this night was not just about a ruined birthday party. It was the explosive culmination of 32 years of emotional erasure, cruel gaslighting, and absolute financial betrayal. Let me take you back to the very beginning, to the exact moment I finally opened my eyes and realized that the people who were supposed to love me were secretly trying to destroy my entire future. Growing up in our household, love was not something given freely. It was an accounting ledger, and the math was entirely rigged. I was born 2 years after my brother Bradley. From the moment I was old enough to understand finances and family roles, I knew exactly where I stood. Bradley was the family investment. I was the operational expense. My parents, Richard and Susan, viewed everything Bradley did as a stroke of genius waiting to be discovered. If Bradley showed an interest in guitar, a $2,000 instrument appeared in his bedroom the next day. If I showed an interest in painting, my mother would hand me a cheap set of watercolors from the clearance aisle and tell me not to make a mess on the carpet. The favoritism was not just emotional. It was deeply systematically financial. When Bradley was accepted to an expensive private university out of state, my father proudly cashed out a significant portion of his retirement savings to cover the tuition, the room, and the board. He told our extended family that Bradley was building a network, that he was destined for greatness, and that a premium education was simply the cost of doing business. 2 years later, when I received my acceptance letter to the state business school, I brought the envelope to the kitchen table with shaking hands, hoping for just a fraction of that same pride. My mother barely looked up from her magazine. She slid a pamphlet for federal student loans across the table and told me I was practical enough to figure it out on my own. She said the family had to tighten its belt to support Bradley's senior year networking trips. I took the loans. I worked the early morning shifts at the campus coffee shop. I took night classes. I figured it out just like they demanded. I graduated at the top of my class and secured a stable, well-paying corporate job. I became a meticulous accounts payable manager. I was responsible. I was reliable. I was entirely invisible. Meanwhile, Bradley dropped out of his prestigious university 6 months before graduation because he had a brilliant idea for a boutique fitness application. My parents funded his startup. It completely failed within 8 months. Then came his luxury car detailing service. It failed. Then came his organic juice distribution company. It failed miserably. Every single time Bradley crashed his life into a wall, Richard and Susan were right there with an open checkbook and a soft landing pad. They drained their savings to protect him from bankruptcy, and when their checkbook finally ran dry, they turned to me. They did not ask for my help with grace or gratitude. They demanded it as a fundamental obligation. I was the one they called when Bradley ignored his tax filings, and the Internal Revenue Service threatened to garnish his wages. I spent entire weekends sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment sorting through his crumpled receipts, untangling his chaotic ledgers and fixing his massive mistakes to save him from federal penalties. My parents never thanked me. They just expected it. My father would clap my shoulder and tell me that a family is an ecosystem, and that the strong members must support the visionaries. But in their minds, the ecosystem only existed to feed Bradley. I was just the soil they walked on. I became the unpaid financial manager for the entire family. I paid my parents' property taxes when my father was between jobs, and the county sent warning letters. I navigated their complicated insurance claims. I even set up the automatic payments for Chloe and Bradley's utility bills, because Chloe claimed that dealing with numbers gave her severe anxiety. I did all of this because deep down I desperately craved their approval. I thought that if I just solved enough problems, if I just saved them enough money, they would finally look at me the way they looked at my brother. I wanted my mother to brag about my corporate promotions the way she bragged about Bradley's imaginary business deals. I wanted my father to look at me with genuine pride, instead of looking at me like an unpaid entry-level employee. That desperate need for validation is exactly what kept me trapped in their cycle of exploitation. I was so used to managing their visible crises that I never stopped to question what was happening behind the scenes. But the blindfold was violently ripped off on a Tuesday in mid-October. It was the day of my 30th birthday. Turning 30 is supposed to be a major life milestone. It is a day when people reflect on their achievements and celebrate with the people who matter most. I knew my family was not going to throw me a gala. They had been planning Bradley's massive 30th birthday party for over 6 months, obsessing over the caterers and the guest list. But I thought maybe they would at least invite me over for dinner. Maybe my mother would bake a cake. Maybe my father would buy a card. I woke up at 6 in the morning, feeling a small, stubborn spark of hope in my chest. I rolled over and checked my phone. The screen illuminated the dark room. There were automated emails from clothing stores offering me birthday discounts. There was a sweet message from my best friend. There was absolutely nothing from my mother. Nothing from my father. Nothing from Bradley. I got out of bed and got dressed for work. I told myself they were just busy. My parents were retired, but Susan treated her neighborhood association meetings like a full-time executive career, and Richard spent his days at the local golf course trying to network with wealthier men to help Bradley find new investors. I drove to my office. I sat at my desk processing complex vendor invoices and approving large corporate wire transfers. Every time my phone vibrated against the wood of my desk, my heart would jump with anticipation. And every single time, it was a work notification or a spam message. I ate a stale turkey sandwich at my desk for lunch. By 5 in the evening, the silence from my family was absolutely deafening. It felt like a heavy physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I drove back to my small, quiet apartment. The sun was setting, casting long, lonely shadows across my living room. I ordered takeout from a local Italian restaurant and stopped at the grocery store to buy myself a single slice of chocolate cake. It was the exact same kind of cheap, marked-down cake my mother used to buy for my birthdays when I was a teenager. I sat at my small kitchen table staring at the single flickering candle I had pushed into the center of the frosting. It was 8 o'clock at night. They had completely forgotten. 30 years on this earth and the people who brought me into it could not even spare 10 seconds to send a text message. At exactly 8:15, my phone screen finally lit up, vibrating aggressively against the kitchen table. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I felt a sudden, pathetic rush of relief wash over me. I quickly cleared my throat, wiped a stray tear from my cheek, and answered the call. I prepared myself to hear a chorus of happy birthday. I prepared myself for clumsy apologies about calling so late in the evening. Instead, I heard my mother's harsh, frantic voice barking orders before I could even say a word of greeting. "Sarah, I need you to pack an overnight bag and drive over to Bradley's house right now," Susan demanded. Her tone was sharp and intensely irritated. She did not say hello. She did not ask how my day was. Bradley and Chloe are having an absolute crisis. His new investors are putting so much pressure on him this week, and Chloe is suffering from terrible anxiety. They booked a last-minute weekend getaway to a luxury spa in the mountains to decompress and save their mental health. Their dog sitter just canceled at the last second, and they need to hit the road in an hour. You need to get over there, get the keys, and watch the dogs until Sunday evening. I sat perfectly still in my kitchen chair. I stared at the melting wax of the candle on my solitary slice of cake. I waited for her to pause. I waited for her to realize what day it was. I waited for her to say anything that proved I was her daughter, and not just a free convenience service. The silence on my end of the line stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. "Are you listening to me, Sarah?" My mother snapped loudly into the receiver. "Grab your things and get in the car. Chloe is practically in tears because she thinks they will have to cancel the resort booking, and they lose the entire deposit if they do not show up tonight. Do not make me ask you twice. The traffic is going to be terrible, so you need to leave right now." The tiny spark of hope inside my chest completely extinguished. It did not fade away. It was crushed out. In its place, a cold, hard knot of pure clarity began to form deep in my stomach. The illusion of family loyalty evaporated, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly truth of my existence in their lives. "No," I said. My voice sounded entirely strange to my own ears. It was quiet, flat, and completely steady. "What do you mean, no?" Susan asked, genuine shock bleeding into her words. Her voice quickly dropped into that dangerous warning tone she always used when I stepped out of line as a child. "This is a severe emergency for your brother. You are just sitting at home doing nothing. You do not have a husband or children to worry about. Your schedule is completely clear. You are going to help your family when they need you." "I am not going, Mom," I replied, refusing to raise my voice. "I am not packing a bag, and I am not driving across town so Bradley and Chloe can go drink champagne at a luxury mountain spa. Do you know what today is? Do you have any idea what day it is today?" There was a brief, tense pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the television playing loudly in the background of her living room. I could hear my father asking her who was on the phone, and why she sounded so irritated. "It is Sarah," my mother told him, her voice dripping with disgust. "She is being incredibly difficult again." Then she spoke directly back into the phone, her patience entirely gone. "I do not have time for your childish guessing games, Sarah. What is so important about today that you cannot be bothered to help your own flesh and blood in a moment of crisis?" "It is my 30th birthday, Mom," I said. The words tasted bitter and dry. "I am 30 years old today. Neither of you called. Bradley did not call. You completely forgot my milestone birthday, and your only reason for contacting me tonight is to demand that I drop everything to be a free pet sitter for a brother who does not even acknowledge my existence. I sat in the silence that followed, foolishly expecting shock. I expected a sudden flurry of guilty apologies. I expected her to feel even a tiny fraction of the profound shame that any normal parent would feel upon realizing they had entirely forgotten their daughter's 30th birthday while demanding free labor. But my mother was not a normal parent. Instead of apologizing, she went directly on the offensive, weaponizing my pain against me. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Susan scoffed, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure exasperation. "You are 30 years old, Sarah. You are a grown woman living in the real world. We are not going to throw you a parade with balloons and confetti every time you get a year older. You are acting incredibly immature and selfish right now. Bradley's marriage and his mental health are literally on the line, and you are throwing a ridiculous temper tantrum over a date on the calendar. This attitude is exactly why you push people away. You are so unbelievably selfish." She did not stop there. She took a breath and drove the knife deeper. "You have always been completely jealous of your brother. You look for any excuse to punish him because he takes risks and goes after what he wants while you just sit in a cubicle. You should be ashamed of yourself for trying to ruin his weekend over something so petty." The accusations hit me with stunning force. Selfish. Jealous. I was the one paying their overdue utility bills. I was the one who spent my weekends doing their complicated tax returns for free. I was the one eating a leftover piece of grocery store cake alone in a dark apartment while they funded my brother's endless luxury vacations. I am not going... I repeated, my voice devoid of all emotion. "Find someone else to solve his problems. If you hang up this phone, Sarah, you will deeply regret it." Susan threatened, her voice venomous and cold. "Family is everything in this world. If you turn your back on us tonight when we need you, do not expect us to be there when you actually need us." "You have never been there when I needed you," I said softly. And then, for the first time in my entire life, I hung up the phone on my mother. I sat in the silent kitchen for a very long time. My phone buzzed 3 times in rapid succession, with angry text messages from Chloe, calling me a pathetic, bitter spinster who was deliberately trying to ruin her marriage out of pure spite. I did not reply to a single word. I turned my phone completely off and placed it face down on the cold granite counter. The tears I had been holding back all day finally fell, but they were not tears of sadness or heartbreak. They were tears of profound, overwhelming exhaustion. I was entirely tired of being the family scapegoat. I was exhausted from being their invisible, unappreciated safety net. But as I sat there in the quiet darkness of my apartment, a new, sharp thought began to slowly creep into my mind. The emotional abuse was obvious, but the financial logic of their lives suddenly did not make any sense. My mother had just called me selfish and jealous because I would not facilitate Bradley's luxury spa trip. A spa trip they had booked at the absolute last minute. A high-end mountain resort weekend that likely cost thousands of dollars just to walk through the door. Bradley's most recent business venture, an upscale catering company, had supposedly gone completely bankrupt just 4 months prior. At the time, my parents had frantically told me they had to drain their emergency savings just to keep his house out of foreclosure. They had begged me to cover their own auto insurance payments for 3 months because they were so financially depleted from helping him. So where exactly was the money coming from right now? How were Bradley and Chloe booking expensive mountain resorts on a whim? How were they suddenly leasing a brand new luxury sport utility vehicle? How was my mother affording the custom high-end landscaping she had just installed in her backyard last month? I had been managing the logistical side of their visible bills for years, making sure the minimum payments were met and the basic taxes were filed. But I had never looked deeply into the underlying credit structures or the asset leverage. I had blindly trusted that the accounts they explicitly asked me to manage were the only accounts they possessed. I had always assumed they were just terribly irresponsible, with money constantly living on the edge of ruin. I never imagined they were deliberately hiding massive sums of money from me. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I stood up from the kitchen table, leaving the melted candle and the untouched cake behind. I walked directly down the short hallway to my home office and turned on the bright overhead light. I was a corporate accounts payable manager. I spent 40 to 50 hours a week tracking complex financial discrepancies, hunting down fraudulent vendor invoices, and reconciling massive, convoluted corporate ledgers. I knew how money moved. I knew how to find missing funds better than almost anyone else. If there was a hidden financial stream fueling my brother's sudden resurrection of wealth, I was going to find it. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The blatant disrespect of the birthday phone call had finally broken the spell of my obedience. I was no longer the helpful invisible daughter trying to earn scraps of affection. I was an auditor, and my family was about to become my primary investigation. I pulled out the secure hard drive where I kept all the family tax documents, bank routing numbers, and property records. Before I dug into their personal accounts, I decided I needed to establish a baseline. I needed to do a comprehensive, merciless audit of my own finances, my own property, and every single account I managed for them. I placed my hands on the keyboard, took one final steadying breath, and began to follow the money. I sat alone in the quiet darkness of my home office. The only light in the room came from the cold blue glow of my laptop screen. The silence of the apartment felt entirely different now. It was no longer the peaceful sanctuary of a quiet evening. It felt like the tense, heavy atmosphere of a crime scene right before the detectives arrive. My mother had just hung up the phone after verbally destroying me for refusing to act as a free pet sitter for my brother. She had called me selfish. She had called me jealous. But as my fingers hovered over the keyboard, I knew the real truth was hiding somewhere in the numbers. Before I could tear into the chaotic, messy financial records of my parents and my brother, my professional training kicked in. I am a corporate accounts payable manager. When you conduct a massive financial audit, you do not start by looking at the suspect. You start by establishing a completely clean baseline. You verify your own standing first. You make sure your own house is in order. For me, that meant checking my own credit report. I had always been incredibly meticulous with my personal finances. I lived well below my means. I drove a reliable, modest car that I had paid off 2 years ago. I paid my credit card balances in full every single month. I had no student loan debt left. The only significant asset to my name was a beautiful rustic 2-bedroom lakeside cabin. The cabin was located 3 hours north of the city, nestled in a quiet grove of pine trees right on the water. It had belonged to my grandfather, William. He was my father's dad, and he was the only person in my family who ever truly saw me. Grandfather William used to sit on the porch of that cabin smoking his pipe, watching the way my parents fawned over Bradley while ignoring me. He never said much about it, but when he passed away 5 years ago, his will contained a massive shock for my parents. He bypassed my father entirely. He left the cabin free and clear of any mortgage or debt directly and solely to me. My parents had been absolutely furious. They argued that a young single woman had no use for a vacation property. They heavily pressured me to sell it and give the money to the family so Bradley could invest it in his latest business venture. I refused. It was the one time in my life I had stood my ground against them. The cabin was my sanctuary. It was my safety net. It was the one place in the world where I felt entirely safe. I navigated to the secure credit reporting website. I typed in my social security number, answered the standard security questions about my previous addresses, and waited for the dashboard to load. I expected to see a pristine credit score and a short, boring list of 2 standard credit cards. The page loaded. My eyes scanned the top row of numbers. My credit score was still excellent. But then I looked at the total outstanding debt column. My heart physically stumbled in my chest. A cold, prickling sensation washed over the back of my neck. I blinked hard, leaning closer to the glowing screen, absolutely certain that the website had made a massive clerical error. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The numbers did not change. The screen clearly displayed an open active debt of $150,000. I stopped breathing. The air in my home office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I gripped the edge of my desk, trying to steady the sudden spinning sensation in my head. I clicked on the detailed breakdown of the accounts. There, listed right below my standard checking account, was a home equity line of credit. It had been opened exactly 14 months ago. The securing asset listed on the loan was my grandfather's lakeside cabin. A wave of pure, unfiltered nausea rolled through my stomach. I had never taken out a loan against the cabin. I had never even considered it. I kept the property taxes paid. I kept the insurance current, and I cherished the fact that I owned it outright. Someone had taken out a massive 6-figure loan using my name, my social security number, and my property as collateral. Panic urged me to immediately pick up the phone and call the bank to report identity theft. But the cold, rational part of my brain, the part that investigated corporate fraud for 50 hours a week, took over. I needed the source documents. I needed to see exactly how this was done before I alerted anyone. I opened a new tab on my browser and went directly to the county recorder's public portal. I paid the small processing fee with my debit card and downloaded the official property records for the cabin. My hands were shaking so violently that I mistyped my password twice. Finally, the heavy digital file downloaded to my desktop. I opened the portable document format file and stared at the recorded deed of trust and the loan origination packet. I scrolled down to the final page of the loan agreement. There, sitting stark in black against the white digital paper, was my signature. I stared at it for a long time. It was a very good forgery, but to a trained eye, it was undeniably a fake. The loops of the letters were slightly too slow, too deliberate. Real signatures have a natural, effortless flow. This signature had been carefully and painstakingly traced. Whoever did this had access to my old tax returns, or my personal checks. I moved my eyes to the right side of the page to inspect the notary public stamp. In order to take out a loan against a piece of real estate, a licensed notary must physically verify the identity of the person signing the document. The stamp belonged to a man named Robert Jenkins. The name instantly rang a bell in my memory. Robert Jenkins was an insurance broker who played golf with my father Richard every single Sunday morning at the local country club. The pieces of the nightmare were beginning to violently snap together. I scrolled back to the top of the loan application to review the contact information. The phone number listed was a prepaid cellular line I did not recognize, but the email address listed for all digital correspondence made my blood run absolutely cold. It was an old Yahoo email account I had used back in high school. When I was 18 years old, my father had helped me set up that specific email address to apply for college financial aid. I had not logged into that account in over a decade. But my father, Richard, had always kept a meticulous locked notebook of family passwords in his home office desk. He still had the login credentials. He had completely hijacked my forgotten digital identity to bypass my current security measures. They had stolen my grandfather's cabin. My own parents had orchestrated a highly coordinated felony-level bank fraud to rip $150,000 of equity out of my name. The betrayal was so profound, so entirely devastating, that I could not even cry. I just sat there frozen in my desk chair, feeling the absolute weight of their cruelty crush the last remaining fragments of my childhood innocence. They had not just taken my money. They had violated my privacy, forged my identity, and risked my entire financial future without a single second of hesitation. But the investigation was not over. I had identified the crime, but I needed to track the movement of the stolen funds. $150,000 does not just disappear into thin air. I looked at the final page of the loan disbursement documents. The bank had wired the funds to a specific commercial checking account. I stared at the 9-digit routing number and the account number. I did not even need to look them up. I had memorized those numbers 2 years ago, when I spent an entire weekend sitting on my living room floor frantically organizing the tax documents for my brother's supposedly failing business. The money had been wired directly into the primary operating account of Bradley's limited liability company. I minimized the property records and opened the cloud-based accounting software that I used to help my family manage their basic tax filings. Because I was the unpaid family bookkeeper, I still had full administrative access to Bradley's corporate ledgers. I navigated to the banking tab and filtered the transactions back to 14 months ago. There it was, a massive incoming wire transfer of $150,000. In the accounting software, Bradley had brazenly categorized the stolen money as an owner capital injection. He had labeled the funds as personal investment money to make his failing business look solvent on paper. I took a sharp breath and clicked on the expense reports for the months immediately following that massive deposit. I needed to see exactly what my stolen future had purchased. My parents had constantly told me that Bradley was a struggling visionary. They had demanded my sympathy, my free labor, and my endless understanding because he was supposedly working himself to the bone to keep his business alive. Susan had always painted Chloe as a devoted, stressed wife who was sacrificing everything to support her husband's entrepreneurial dreams. The general ledger told a completely different, absolutely sickening story. The stolen funds were not used to save a struggling business. They were not used to pay off aggressive vendors or settle outstanding business debts. The money was systematically drained to fund a fake, luxurious lifestyle that was entirely designed to impress Chloe's wealthy, judgmental parents. I scrolled through the line items, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. Exactly 3 days after the fraudulent loan cleared, there was a recorded outgoing wire transfer for $32,000. The payee was a luxury automotive dealership in the affluent suburbs. I remembered exactly what happened 14 months ago. That was the exact same week Chloe showed up to Sunday dinner, driving a brand new, fully loaded luxury sport utility vehicle. She had bragged to the entire family that Bradley's business was doing so incredibly well, that he had surprised her with her dream car. I had congratulated her, genuinely happy for their supposed success, completely unaware that I was the one who had actually bought the car. I kept scrolling down the screen. The sheer audacity of their spending was breathtaking. There was a transaction for $15,000 paid directly to the elite Oak Creek Country Club. The memo line noted it was for initiation fees and past due membership dues. Bradley and Chloe had been posting photos on social media all summer, drinking expensive cocktails by the country club pool, pretending they belonged to the upper crust of society. There were dozens of smaller regular withdrawals categorized vaguely as business consulting fees or client entertainment expenses. I cross-referenced the dates and the vendors. These were not business expenses. They were thousands of dollars spent at high-end designer boutiques in the city. They were massive bills from luxury steakhouses, where Bradley liked to play the big-shot entrepreneur, ordering expensive bottles of wine for his friends. There were payments to high-end mountain resorts, matching the exact same spas my mother had demanded I facilitate by acting as their free dog sitter just an hour ago. They were literally wearing my grandfather's legacy on their backs. They were driving my financial security around town. They were drinking my future at the country club. I looked at the current balance of Bradley's corporate account. The $150,000 was almost entirely gone. There was less than $8,000 left. They had burned through a massive fortune in 14 months just to maintain the illusion of success. I leaned back in my desk chair and stared at the dark wall of my home office. The pieces of the puzzle were now fully assembled, and the final picture was monstrous. My parents had actively conspired to commit a federal crime. My father had provided my old email address and used his golfing buddy to fake a legal notary stamp. My mother had clearly known about the money, considering she was the one constantly defending Bradley's sudden wealth and demanding I support his luxury lifestyle. And Bradley had happily taken the stolen equity, laundering it through his business account to fund a spectacular lie. They did not view me as a daughter or a sister or even a human being. I was nothing more than a resource to be harvested. When they realized they could not openly manipulate me into selling the cabin, they had simply decided to steal it behind my back. They had gambled my entire financial life assuming that the quiet, obedient, invisible corporate manager would never actually check the ledgers. They assumed that by the time I eventually tried to sell the cabin years down the line, Bradley would be a massive success, and he would quietly pay the loan back before I ever noticed. Or more likely, they assumed I would just take the loss to protect the family reputation. They had mortgaged my future to fund my brother's facade. I closed the accounting software. I downloaded every single digital document, every forged signature, every bank transfer record, and every line item of Bradley's fraudulent spending. I saved 3 encrypted copies onto separate external hard drives. The tears were completely gone now. The exhaustion that had weighed me down all day had entirely evaporated. In its place, a cold, hard, absolutely terrifying anger began to take root deep inside my chest. It was not the kind of hot, chaotic anger that makes people scream or throw things. It was a precise, calculating, deeply focused rage. For 32 years, I had allowed them to treat me like dirt. I had allowed them to minimize my achievements, forget my birthdays, and demand my endless servitude. But this was not just emotional neglect. This was financial violence. They had crossed a line that could never, ever be uncrossed. My mother had told me on the phone that if I did not help my family, I would deeply regret it. She had warned me that family was everything in this world. I turned off my laptop and sat in the quiet darkness of my apartment. I was not going to scream. I was not going to call them and demand an explanation. I was not going to give them the opportunity to gaslight me, cry, or manipulate their way out of this trap. I was an accounts payable manager. I knew exactly how to balance a ledger. and my family's account was severely, fatally overdrawn. It was time for me to collect the debt. The sun had barely started to rise over the city when I finally stood up from my desk. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes were burning dry and exhausted from staring at glowing screens all night, but my mind was moving with absolute terrifying clarity. I had spent the past 8 hours downloading, printing, and organizing every single piece of evidence. I had the forged loan application. I had the fraudulent notary stamp from my father's golfing buddy, Robert Jenkins. I had the bank transfer records showing the massive sum of money moving directly into Bradley's corporate account. And I had the itemized ledger proving that my stolen future was used to pay for country club memberships, luxury vehicles, and high-end vacations. I placed the thick stack of printed papers into a plain manila folder. I took a quick shower, putting on a clean, simple pair of jeans and a plain sweater. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the same obedient, invisible daughter who had cried over a forgotten birthday just 12 hours ago. That woman was gone. In her place was an auditor who had just uncovered a massive financial crime committed by the people she trusted most in the world. I drove to my parents' house in the affluent, quiet suburbs. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and expensive cars sitting in wide driveways. It was a beautiful, crisp Saturday morning. Families were waking up, walking their dogs, pouring their first cups of coffee. It all looked so perfectly normal. But as I pulled my modest 10-year-old car up to the curb outside my parents' large, immaculate colonial home, the illusion of their perfect suburban life made me feel physically sick. I walked up the paved driveway and unlocked the front door with my spare key. I stepped into the grand foyer. The house smelled faintly of expensive vanilla candles and fresh coffee. I walked down the hallway and stepped into the large, custom-designed kitchen. My mother, Susan, was sitting at the massive granite island. She was wearing a silk robe, casually flipping through a glossy home decor magazine, sipping her morning coffee from a delicate porcelain mug. My father, Richard, was standing near the back door, cheerfully polishing his expensive white golf shoes. It was a picture of absolute, undisturbed peace. They were completely relaxed. They were completely unbothered by the fact that they had completely forgotten my 30th birthday the night before. They were completely unbothered by the fact that they had stolen a massive fortune from me to fund my brother's luxurious lies. My mother looked up from her magazine when she heard my footsteps on the hardwood floor. A look of severe annoyance immediately crossed her face.
"Sarah, what on earth are you doing here so early?"
Susan asked, her voice dripping with instant irritation. "If you are here to complain about last night, I simply do not have the energy for it. I already told you that you were being incredibly selfish, and I expected you to spend the weekend reflecting on your behavior. Bradley and Chloe are already on their way to the mountain spa." My father looked up from his golf shoes. He offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Morning, Sarah. Your mother is right. Let it go. We do not need any family drama this weekend. I have an early tea time with Robert Jenkins and a few potential investors for Bradley." I did not say a word in response. I walked directly to the granite kitchen island. I stopped right across from my mother. I raised the heavy manila folder and dropped it flat onto the smooth stone surface. It hit the counter with a loud, heavy slap that echoed sharply in the quiet kitchen. Susan flinched, pulling her coffee mug back. "What is wrong with you? What is this garbage?" "Open it," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. It was flat cold and entirely devoid of the desperation they were so used to hearing from me. My father stopped polishing his shoes. He slowly walked over to the kitchen island, sensing the strange, heavy shift in my demeanor. He reached out and opened the manila folder. He looked down at the first page. It was the closing document for the $150,000 home equity line of credit taken out against my grandfather's lakeside cabin. I watched his face intently. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The relaxed, patronizing confidence completely vanished from his features. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin looking like pale, wet clay. His hands froze on the edges of the paper. He did not ask what the document was. He knew exactly what it was. Susan leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the dense legal text. "Richard, what is this? What is she showing us?" "It is a fraudulent loan," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead onto my father's pale face. A loan for $150,000 taken out against my property without my knowledge. And if you turn to the third page, you will see my forged signature notarized by your good friend Robert Jenkins. And if you turn to the fifth page, you will see the wire transfer sending every single penny of that stolen equity directly into Bradley's failing business account. The kitchen went absolutely silent. The only sound was the soft humming of the massive luxury refrigerator. I stood there waiting for the apologies. I waited for my father to collapse into tears of shame. I waited for my mother to gasp in horror and beg for my forgiveness. I waited for them to offer some kind of desperate explanation for why they would commit a federal felony to destroy their own daughter's financial future. But that is not what happened. My father slowly closed the folder. He took a deep, steadying breath. When he looked back up at me, the fear in his eyes had already been replaced by a cold, calculating defensiveness. He did not look ashamed. He looked annoyed that he had been caught. "You went digging through private financial records," Richard said. His tone was suddenly sharp and accusing, as if my discovery of his massive crime was the actual problem. "You had absolutely no right to go poking around in Bradley's corporate accounts, Sarah." I stared at him, genuinely stunned by his sheer audacity. "I am the one who balances his books because he is too incompetent to do it himself. I am the one you call when the Internal Revenue Service threatens him. You forged my signature, Dad. You stole my house." "We did not steal anything," my father snapped loudly, slamming his hand down on top of the folder. "We leveraged an idle asset for the good of the family. You were not doing anything with that cabin. It was just sitting there gathering dust while your brother was drowning. He needed capital. He needed a runway to secure his new clients. We are a family, Sarah. What is yours is ours. That is how a family survives." I felt a cold wave of pure revulsion wash over my entire body. He was actually trying to rationalize a felony. He was trying to frame his theft as some kind of noble family sacrifice. "You committed bank fraud," I said, emphasizing every single word. "You used an old email address of mine to bypass the bank security alerts. You had Robert fake a legal document. You robbed me to fund a lie." Susan suddenly shoved her chair back and stood up. Her face was flushed bright red. She did not look at the forged signature. She did not care about the crime. She only cared about protecting the golden child. "How dare you speak to your father that way?" Susan yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Your grandfather never should have left that cabin to you in the first place. He was a bitter old man who wanted to punish Richard. That property belongs to this family. We were going to pay the loan back before you ever even noticed it was gone. Bradley just needs a little more time for his business to turn a massive profit." "His business is dead, Mom," I fired back, finally letting a fraction of my anger bleed into my voice. "His business has been dead for a year." I looked at the ledgers. "Do you want to know where my stolen equity actually went? It went to a luxury car dealership so Chloe could drive a status symbol. It went to the country club so Bradley could pretend he was a wealthy executive. It went to expensive mountain resorts. You did not invest in his business. You funded a massive, pathetic illusion, and you made me pay for it without my consent." "Stop being so dramatic!" Susan screamed. Real tears suddenly sprang into her eyes, but they were tears of pure defensive rage. She began to cry, throwing her hands up in the air to perform her classic role as the victim. "You are just trying to destroy your brother. You have always been so deeply, horribly jealous of him. You are jealous that he has a beautiful wife. You are jealous that he has ambition. You found out about a temporary harmless bridge loan, and now you are trying to tear this family apart over petty money issues. Petty money issues. $150,000 of stolen equity, and my mother was calling it a petty money issue. She was actively gaslighting me right to my face. She was trying to rewrite reality, desperately trying to make me feel like I was a cruel, unreasonable monster for being upset that my entire financial future had been hijacked." "It is not a bridge loan," I said, my voice dropping back to a quiet, icy whisper. "It is a felony. It is identity theft, and I am not going to pay it." Before my parents could launch into another round of aggressive manipulation, the front door of the house suddenly opened. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. A few seconds later, Bradley walked into the kitchen. He was wearing expensive designer athletic wear, holding a set of luxury car keys in his hand. He looked completely relaxed, likely coming over to eat my parents' food before heading off on his luxury mountain getaway. Bradley stopped in his tracks when he saw the intense, hostile atmosphere in the room. He looked at my mother, who was actively weeping angry tears. He looked at my father, who was standing defensively over the manila folder. Then he looked at me. "What is going on?" Bradley asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Why is everyone yelling so early in the morning?" "Your sister went snooping through your business accounts," my father said sharply, pointing a rigid finger at me. "She found the paperwork for the equity line." Bradley's eyebrows shot up. For one brief fleeting second, I actually saw a flash of genuine panic in his eyes. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew he had actively laundered stolen money through his corporate accounts. But Bradley was incredibly practiced at escaping consequences. Within 3 seconds, the panic completely vanished, replaced by his trademark arrogant smirk. He slowly walked over to the kitchen island. He did not look at the folder. He looked directly at me, shaking his head with a heavy, patronizing sigh. "Come on, Sarah," Bradley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do not make a massive deal out of this. You are overreacting as usual." "I am overreacting," I repeated, staring at my brother in absolute disbelief. "You happily took $150,000 of stolen money. Money stolen from my name. You used it to buy a luxury car for your wife and pretend you are a successful entrepreneur." "It is not stolen." Bradley laughed, actually waving his hand at me like I was a foolish child who did not understand complex adult concepts. "It is just creative financing. Look, Sarah, you are a corporate drone. You sit in a cubicle all day balancing boring spreadsheets. You have excellent credit, no debt, and practically zero living expenses. You do not need that equity right now. I am building an empire. I have to project success to attract high-level investors. You have to spend money to make money. I am just borrowing your leverage for a little while." "You forged my signature," I stated plainly, refusing to let him spin his narrative. "Dad signed the paperwork, not me," Bradley immediately countered effortlessly, throwing our father under the bus to legally protect himself. "I just received a business transfer. But seriously, Sarah, take one for the team. When my new application launches next year, I will pay off the loan and even give you a little bonus for the inconvenience. Just keep your mouth shut and let me handle the business side of things." He was so incredibly casual about it. He genuinely believed that my life, my credit, and my property were completely at his disposal. He genuinely believed that because I was the quiet, boring sister, I existed solely to be consumed by his ambitions. "I am not keeping my mouth shut," I said. "I am going to the police. I am going to the bank." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from Bradley's face. My mother stopped her fake crying. My father stood completely rigid, his hands clenching into tight fists at his sides. The reality of my words hung in the quiet air of the kitchen. "If you go to the police," my father said, his voice dropping into a dark, threatening growl, "you will send your own father to federal prison, Sarah. Is that what you want? Do you want to see me in handcuffs? Do you want to ruin Robert Jenkins' life too? He has a wife and children." "You will destroy my marriage," Bradley added immediately, stepping closer to me, using his physical size to try and intimidate me. "Chloe does not know where the capital came from. If you blow this up, she will leave me. You will completely destroy my life over a temporary loan. Are you really that vindictive? Are you really that bitter and hateful? Think about what you are doing, Sarah," Susan hissed, stepping out from behind the kitchen island. She moved closer to me, her eyes narrow and filled with pure malice. "If you report this, you will completely tear this family apart. You will be dead to us. We will never speak to you again. You will be entirely alone in this world. You will be the villain who sent her father to jail and ruined her brother's future just because she wanted to hold on to a stupid piece of wood in the woods." They surrounded me. They formed a tight, aggressive triangle of manipulation, guilt, and severe emotional abuse. They threw every single weapon they had at me. They used my fear of abandonment. They used my deep-seated desire for a family. They placed the entire moral weight of their own criminal actions directly onto my shoulders. They were telling me that if I defended myself, I was the abuser. If I protected my future, I was the villain. They looked at me with hard, expectant eyes. They expected me to fold. They expected the reliable, invisible workhorse to drop her head, swallow her pride, and quietly accept the burden. For 32 years, that was exactly what I had done. Whenever they pushed, I yielded. Whenever they demanded, I provided. They were absolutely certain that they had completely broken my spirit a long time ago. I looked at my father, who was willing to let me pay for his felony. I looked at my mother, who hated me for holding them accountable. I looked at my brother, who viewed my life as nothing more than a bank account waiting to be drained. I did not argue anymore. I did not scream. I did not try to convince them of the extreme cruelty of their actions. You cannot reason with parasites. You can only remove them. I let my shoulders drop slightly. I let my expression soften into a look of defeated resignation. I manufactured the exact look of compliance they were waiting to see. I took a slow, shaky breath and looked down at the floor, playing the role of the broken daughter to absolute perfection. "Okay," I whispered quietly. The intense, hostile energy in the kitchen instantly evaporated. My father let out a massive, audible sigh of pure relief. Bradley's arrogant smirk immediately returned to his face. My mother crossed her arms, looking incredibly satisfied with herself. "I knew you would see reason, Sarah," my father said, patting my shoulder in a gesture that made my skin crawl. "We are family. We protect each other. You are doing the right thing." "It is just for a little while longer," Bradley chimed in, cheerfully picking up his car keys again. "I promise, as soon as the new funding round closes, I will clear the debt. You will not even remember this happened." "Now," Susan said briskly, completely moving past the fact that they had just terrorized me into accepting a massive fraud. "Are you going to drive over to Bradley's house and watch the dogs for the weekend? Or do I need to cancel my own plans to do it?" "I will go," I said softly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the granite counter. "I will go watch the dogs. You guys enjoy your weekend." "Good girl," my mother said dismissively, already turning her back on me to pick up her glossy magazine. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I walked down the grand hallway, opened the heavy front door, and stepped out into the bright, crisp morning air. I walked down the driveway to my modest 10-year-old car. I got inside, closed the door, and locked it. I did not drive to Bradley's house to watch his dogs. I did not drive back to my apartment to cry. I gripped the steering wheel. My hands were perfectly steady. My mind was completely clear. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully manipulated me into silent submission. They thought they could continue to drain my future, to fund their fraudulent, luxurious facade. They had no idea that they had just given me the ultimate advantage. They had given me their absolute blind trust. They were going to continue spending the stolen money. They were going to continue using the compromised accounts. They were going to leave a fresh, undeniable trail of continuous criminal evidence. I started the engine of my car. I put it in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving their perfect suburban illusion behind in the rearview mirror. I did not drive home. I drove directly toward the city center. I had an appointment to make. It was time to find a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud, and it was time to meticulously, quietly, and entirely destroy their lives. I drove away from my parents' house without looking back. For 32 years, I had been trained to turn around. I had been conditioned to apologize. I had been taught to smooth things over and swallow my pride for the sake of the family. I had been groomed to believe that keeping the peace was my primary duty as a daughter, even if that peace cost me my own sanity and financial security. But as my car merged onto the highway heading back toward the city, I felt a fundamental, permanent shift take place inside my chest. The suffocating weight of their emotional manipulation simply evaporated. The heavy, toxic guilt they had just tried to drown me in dissolved into the crisp morning air. I did not cry a single tear. My hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute, unshakable certainty. They had expected me to fold. They had banked on my lifelong habit of unquestioning obedience. They honestly thought that by threatening to cut me off, they were dealing the ultimate devastating punishment. They did not realize they were actually handing me the key to my own cage. I was a corporate accounts payable manager. I spent my days hunting down financial discrepancies, tracking unauthorized commercial transactions, and ruthlessly balancing ledgers for a massive corporation. My parents had just handed me a forged $150,000 home equity line of credit, and they had dared me to accept it. They had challenged the wrong woman. The drive back to my apartment took 45 minutes, and I used every single second of that time to compartmentalize my emotions. I took the deep, aching betrayal of my parents, choosing my brother over my future, and I packed it away into a small, dark box in the back of my mind. There would be time to grieve the loss of my family later. Right now, I had a job to do. I needed to protect my grandfather's cabin. I needed to secure my financial identity. And I needed to execute a counterattack so thorough and legally binding that they would never be able to manipulate me or steal from me ever again. I knew I could not handle a crime of this magnitude alone. I also knew I could not go to just any local small-town lawyer who might be swayed by my father's community connections or my mother's fake tears. This was federal bank fraud. This was aggravated identity theft. This was a coordinated embezzlement scheme involving a fake notary public. I needed a serious specialist. I needed someone cold calculating and entirely immune to suburban family drama. Through my corporate network at the office, I had heard highly respected whispers of a senior financial litigation attorney named Jonathan Hayes. He was a former federal prosecutor who now handled high-stakes commercial disputes and complex corporate embezzlement recovery cases. He had a formidable reputation for being absolutely ruthless in the courtroom and completely unbothered by emotional manipulation. He was exactly the kind of predator I needed on my side. I called his office the moment I walked into my apartment. I informed his receptionist that I was a corporate financial manager who had just uncovered a 6-figure multi-party bank fraud involving forged real estate deeds, and I needed an emergency consultation. The receptionist put me on hold for exactly 2 minutes before returning to offer me an appointment for 2:00 that very same afternoon. I sent an email to my boss stating I had an unavoidable and severe family emergency requiring a personal day. It was the only lie I told that day, and honestly, it was entirely true in its own twisted way. The emergency was just a completely different kind than my boss likely expected. I parked in the underground garage of a sleek, towering glass building in the downtown financial district. The air down there felt cool and professional. I rode the silent elevator up to the 47th floor. The offices of Hayes and Partners were immaculate. The walls were paneled in rich, dark wood. The floors were polished marble. It was a space designed to intimidate the weak and reassure the powerful. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my tailored navy suit, and walked up to the reception desk. I was no longer Sarah, the invisible sister. I was a client bringing a massive fraud case to a former federal prosecutor. A paralegal led me into a massive corner office overlooking the sprawling city skyline. Jonathan Hayes sat behind a heavy, dark mahogany desk. He was a man in his late 50s, with sharp gray eyes, silver hair neatly combed back, and the calm, incredibly still posture of someone who never lost a negotiation. He motioned for me to take a seat in one of the plush leather chairs across from him. He did not offer small talk. He simply asked me why I had requested an emergency meeting. I did not waste his time with a long, emotional backstory. I did not cry about my mother calling me jealous. I did not complain about my father trying to frame his felony as a noble family sacrifice. I simply opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, meticulously organized manila folder I had compiled during my sleepless night. I slid it squarely across the polished wood of his desk. I told him clearly and calmly that I needed to report a massive coordinated financial fraud involving a forged home equity line of credit against my private property. I told him my identity had been stolen by my own parents to fund my brother's failing business and lavish lifestyle. I told him I needed to ensure the perpetrators faced the maximum legal and financial consequences available under the law, and I needed to clear the fraudulent lien from my property title. Jonathan Hayes opened the folder. The office went entirely quiet, save for the soft sound of paper turning. He reviewed the downloaded property deeds. He examined the loan origination documents. He stared intently at the fake notary stamp belonging to my father's golfing buddy, Robert Jenkins. He traced my forged signature with his pen. Then he moved on to the detailed corporate ledgers I had pulled from my brother's business accounts. He reviewed my cross-referenced spreadsheets showing exactly where the stolen money had gone over the past 14 months. He saw the $32,000 wire transfer for my sister-in-law Chloe's luxury sport utility vehicle. He saw the $15,000 payment for the country club initiation fees. He saw the endless string of high-end restaurant bills and luxury mountain resort vacations. He did not speak for 20 solid minutes. He read every single page I had provided. When he finally closed the folder and looked up at me, his expression was completely serious, but there was a distinct, undeniable glimmer of professional respect shining in his sharp gray eyes. He leaned back in his leather chair and told me that my documentation was more thorough and damning than what he usually received from highly paid private investigators. He told me I had done half his job for him, And then leaning forward and folding his hands on his desk, he delivered the harsh, absolute, legal reality of my situation. He explained the law with surgical precision. Because my signature was forged, and because I had absolutely no knowledge of the loan origination, I was not legally liable for the $150,000 debt. The contract was inherently void due to fraud. However, he warned me that there was a massive, unforgiving catch. In order to legally clear my name, and in order to force the bank to remove the massive lien they had placed against my grandfather's lakeside cabin, I had to formally report the identity theft. I had to file a sworn police report, and I had to submit a formal fraud affidavit directly to the bank's internal investigation division. I could not quietly make the debt disappear. I could not protect my family and protect myself at the exact same time. Jonathan Hayes looked at me with deep intensity. He told me that if I stayed silent in an attempt to save my father from federal prison, the law would automatically interpret my silence as complicity and acceptance. By not reporting the fraud the moment I discovered it, I would legally assume the entire debt. I would be forced by the bank to pay back every single penny my brother Bradley and his wife Chloe had spent on their lavish fake lifestyle. I would be forced to pay the accumulated interest. And if I could not make those massive monthly payments, the bank would ruthlessly foreclose on my property. My grandfather's cabin would be seized and sold at auction to cover my family's crimes. It was a harsh binary choice. I either reported my own parents and my own brother for felony bank fraud, or I accepted absolute financial ruin for the rest of my life. There was no middle ground. There was no secret third option where everyone walked away happy. I sat in the quiet office and thought about my parents demanding I drive across town on my 30th birthday to act as a free pet sitter. I thought about Chloe mocking my corporate job while driving a luxury vehicle purchased with my stolen equity. I thought about my father telling me I would destroy the family if I did not gladly accept a 6-figure debt for a brother who never even called me. I looked Jonathan Hayes directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I told him to draft the fraud affidavits. I told him I wanted to press every single criminal charge available. I told him I wanted to completely sever my financial and legal ties to the people who had exploited me. Jonathan Hayes smiled. It was a very small, very dangerous smile. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. He told me we were going to absolutely destroy them. But then he raised a hand, stopping me before I could ask him to call the police right that second. He told me we needed to wait. He laid out a legal and psychological strategy that was brilliantly, devastatingly cold. He explained that if we confronted them immediately, or if we froze the accounts today, they would have time to scramble. My father would hire a defense attorney. They would try to hide assets. Bradley would claim the money was a legitimate business loan and try to muddy the waters in civil court. They would try to drag the legal proceedings out for years, draining my resources and exhausting my spirit. Instead, Jonathan advised me to set a silent trap. We were going to use their own arrogance and entitlement against them. He told me to go back to my parents and pretend they had won. He told me to play the role of the beaten-down, obedient daughter one last time. I needed to tell them I understood their reasoning. I needed to promise them I would stay absolutely quiet. By giving them a false sense of absolute security, they would continue to spend the stolen money. They would continue to use the compromised accounts to fund their lifestyle. Every time they swiped a card tied to that fraudulent home equity line of credit, they would be generating fresh, undeniable evidence of ongoing, active embezzlement. They would be proving to the federal investigators that this was not a one-time mistake or a misunderstood family loan. It was a continuous, deliberate pattern of criminal theft. While they were busy enjoying their stolen wealth, Jonathan and I would be working directly with the bank's highest-level fraud division, in complete secrecy. We would submit the forged documents. We would provide the fake notary information. We would let the bank's federal investigators build an airtight, completely bulletproof case behind closed doors. And then we would strategically time the freezing of all their accounts for maximum undeniable impact. We would cut off their money supply at the exact moment they needed it most. We would let them walk right up to the edge of a massive financial cliff, smiling and waving to their wealthy friends, and then we would completely remove the ground from beneath their feet. I listened to his plan, feeling a profound sense of awe at the absolute precision of his legal mind. It was not just about clearing my debt. It was about ensuring they could never manipulate their way out of the consequences. It was about delivering a level of justice so complete that my family would never be able to recover their false social standing. I signed the retainer agreement right there on his mahogany desk. I handed over my credit card to pay his substantial initial fee, knowing it was the best investment I had ever made in my entire life. I left the folder of evidence in his capable hands. When I walked out of the Columbia Center and stepped back onto the bustling streets of the city financial district, the rain had finally stopped. The gray clouds were beginning to break apart. I took a deep breath of the damp city air. I had walked into that building as a victim of a massive family betrayal. I was walking out as a woman holding a ticking time bomb. My parents and my brother thought they had successfully buried me under their debts. They had no idea I was quietly holding the match that was going to burn their entire fake empire straight to the ground. All I had to do now was smile, play my part, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. I drove back to my parents' house in the pristine, quiet suburbs 2 days after our explosive confrontation. The drive felt entirely different this time. I was no longer a terrified, unappreciated daughter driving to her emotional slaughter. I was a predator willingly stepping back into a cage I had now learned how to lock from the outside. I parked my modest 10-year-old car in the street, intentionally leaving the prime driveway spot open for my brother's leased luxury vehicle. I walked up to the heavy oak front door and knocked. My mother, Susan, opened it. She was wearing her typical expression of deep, aggressive inconvenience, her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. I took a deep breath, looked down at my practical work shoes, and manufactured the exact image of a defeated, broken woman. I stepped into the grand foyer and told her I was deeply sorry. I forced my voice to tremble just enough to sound authentic. I told her I had overreacted about the loan because I was stressed about turning 30, and that I had let my emotions get the better of me. I said I understood that family comes first, and that I did not want to ruin my relationship with my only brother or see my own father face any terrible legal trouble. I swallowed every single ounce of my pride to deliver that lie. It tasted like pure ash in my mouth, but I knew it was the necessary cost of my ultimate freedom. Susan let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. The harsh, defensive anger completely melted off her face, replaced instantly by a look of smug, victorious satisfaction. She stepped back and allowed me into the living room. My father, Richard, emerged from his home office holding a cup of premium coffee. He looked incredibly triumphant. He walked over, patted me heavily on the shoulder, and told me he knew I would eventually come to my senses. He said I was finally acting like a real team player, and that holding grudges over money was beneath our family value. Bradley happened to be sitting on the expensive leather sofa in the living room, casually scrolling through his smartphone. He did not even bother to stand up to greet me. He just smirked a terrible, arrogant expression that made my blood run absolutely cold. He told me not to worry my boring little corporate head about the complex finances. He promised with absolute sickening false sincerity that he would pay me back the moment his brilliant new business secured its next massive round of funding. He called me a good sister for taking one for the team. They all completely relaxed. The thick, hostile tension vanished from the house. They actually believed they had won. They believed they had successfully terrorized me into silent submission, just as they had done for my entire life. They believed I was simply too weak, too desperate for their toxic love to ever actually fight back. They had absolutely no idea that my submission was nothing more than a carefully constructed Trojan horse. They had just opened their gates and invited their own absolute destruction directly inside. The immediate, devastating result of their renewed confidence was a massive, sickening escalation in their spending. Bradley had recently been feeling extremely insecure around his wife Chloe's wealthy family. Chloe's parents were old money. They lived in a gated community, took vacations in Europe, and had been making subtle, sharp, condescending remarks about Bradley's obvious lack of tangible success. Bradley was desperate to prove to them that he was a high-level, thriving entrepreneur. He needed a grand, undeniable spectacle to silence their judgment. So, entirely emboldened by the fact that he had a fresh, uncontested line of credit secretly secured by my grandfather's property, he decided to throw himself a lavish, incredibly expensive 30th birthday gala. My mother called me the very next morning to announce these grand, ridiculous plans. She did not ask if I was doing okay. She did not ask if I wanted to help. She just started barking orders through the phone, as if I were her personal unpaid assistant. Bradley had booked the Grand Oak Country Club, the most exclusive and expensive event venue in the entire county. Susan informed me that I was required to act as the on-site event coordinator. I needed to pick up the custom floral arrangements, coordinate the complicated delivery of a massive hand-carved ice sculpture, and ensure the cases of vintage champagne were perfectly chilled by the venue staff. I sat at my desk in my corporate office and listened to her list off demands that were being funded by my stolen identity. I agreed to every single task with a polite, obedient tone. That night, I logged into my remote accounting software. Because I had previously managed Bradley's chaotic books, my access credentials were still perfectly active. I watched the new charges hit the fraudulent account in real time. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. I saw a $10,000 charge process for the premium catering deposit. I saw $5,000 leave the account to pay a boutique city florist for imported white orchids. I tracked an $8,000 wire transfer to secure a live classical string quartet and an absolute top-tier open bar. He was literally draining the equity from the only asset my grandfather had ever given me, all to fund a $42,000 party just to impress his pretentious in-laws. The absolute staggering audacity of his actions made me physically sick to my stomach. I lived on a strict budget. I cooked my meals at home. I wore practical clothes. And my brother was casually spending a down payment on a house just to buy a few hours of fake adoration. But instead of crying, I just smiled at my glowing computer screen. I watched the numbers dwindle. I watched the fraudulent debt rise. I dutifully answered my mother's daily phone calls. I confirmed the delivery schedules for the luxury linens. I played the perfect invisible compliant servant, watching them eagerly and aggressively dig their own inescapable financial grave, while I was spending my lunch breaks picking up dry cleaning for Bradley's custom-tailored tuxedo. I was also making my final fatal moves in the shadows. On a quiet, rainy Tuesday morning, I took another personal day from my corporate job. I drove my modest car straight to the Central Police Precinct in the city. I walked into the Financial Crimes Division and sat down at the metal desk of a veteran detective. I did not cry. I did not act like a terrified victim. I laid out the thick, meticulously organized manila folder my attorney had helped me prepare. I handed over the original property deeds proving I was the sole owner of the lakeside cabin. I handed over the fraudulent loan documents. I provided the undeniable evidence of the fake notary stamp belonging to my father's country club friend Robert Jenkins. And I presented the clear, indisputable bank routing numbers that tied the stolen funds directly to Bradley's personal corporate account. The detective listened to my story in absolute heavy silence. When he examined the blatantly forged signature on the final page of the loan agreement, and then looked at the corresponding money trail highlighting the luxury car payments and the country club dues, his expression turned to pure, hardened professional disgust. He looked at me and shook his head, muttering that he had seen a lot of terrible family disputes in his career, but this level of coordinated cold-blooded theft by a parent against their own child was uniquely repulsive. He formally filed the official identity theft report. He printed out the documentation and handed me the official stamped case number. That single piece of paper was my ultimate shield. It was the absolute legal proof that I was a victim of a felony crime, not a willing participant in a family loan. With the sworn police report securely in my briefcase, my next stop was the towering glass building that housed the regional headquarters of the bank that currently held the fraudulent home equity line of credit. My attorney had already bypassed the standard customer service representatives and set up a highly confidential private meeting with a senior investigator in the bank's Central Corporate Fraud Division. I was escorted into a cold, sterile conference room with frosted glass walls. The investigator was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who reviewed my file with clinical, terrifying precision. I handed over the police report, the forged notary details, and the detailed ledgers showing my brother continuously draining the bank's funds for luxury personal expenses. She cross-referenced my documents with the bank's internal systems. Within 20 minutes, she confirmed the reality of my situation. Because the loan was obtained through verified documented identity theft, I would be completely absolved of the massive debt. The bank would legally remove the catastrophic lien against my grandfather's lakeside cabin. The financial burden would fall entirely crushingly onto the people who had committed the fraud. But then came the crucial final part of my strategy. I leaned across the polished mahogany conference table and looked the senior investigator directly in the eyes. I told her that I did not want the account frozen immediately. She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my request. Most victims want the bleeding to stop the very second they prove the fraud. I explained my reasoning with calm, chilling logic. I told her that the primary suspect, my brother Bradley, was actively using the compromised account to fund a massive high-profile gala scheduled for that coming Saturday night. If the bank froze the funds today, Bradley would simply receive a standard alert. He would scramble to cancel the event, hide his tracks, or manipulate Chloe's wealthy parents into covering the sudden shortfall. He would find a way to escape the immediate public consequences of his actions, but if we waited, we could catch him in the absolute undeniable act of massive financial fraud. He had secured the venue with a card tied to the stolen funds, and the final massive balance was due on the night of the party. I asked the investigator to schedule the total asset freeze for exactly 8:00 in the morning, on Saturday, the exact day of the gala. The investigator stared at me for a long moment. She saw the cold, unyielding resolve in my eyes. She understood exactly what I was doing. I was not just stopping a crime. I was orchestrating a public execution of my family's stolen reputation. She smiled, a very small, incredibly sharp smile. She turned to her computer and typed a series of commands into the secure banking system. The trap was officially set in stone. The dominoes were perfectly aligned and waiting for the final push. All I had to do now was show up to the grand ballroom on Saturday night, wear my cheap navy dress, sit quietly in the background, like the good invisible sister, and wait for the venue director to bring out the final bill. The final week leading up to Bradley's 30th birthday gala was an absolute masterclass in psychological endurance. I had to continue playing the role of the beaten-down, obedient daughter, all while knowing that the bank's federal investigators were quietly preparing to drop a massive guillotine on my family's entire financial existence. The hardest part was not the waiting. The hardest part was surviving my mother's relentless daily demands. On Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was sitting at my desk approving corporate invoices. It was Susan. She did not say hello. She immediately launched into a frantic, aggressive list of chores she expected me to complete for Bradley's party. She told me the event planner at the Grand Oak Country Club was completely incompetent, and that I needed to step in as the unpaid day of coordinator. She demanded that I arrive at the venue at 10 in the morning on Saturday. I was expected to personally unbox and arrange 50 custom floral centerpieces, coordinate the arrival of the classical string quartet, and ensure the caterers had properly chilled the vintage champagne. I sat in my office chair listening to her complain about the exorbitant cost of imported white orchids. She actually had the absolute audacity to sigh heavily and tell me that the family was making such massive financial sacrifices to give Bradley the night he deserved. She told me I needed to pull my weight and contribute my labor since I was not contributing any actual capital to the event. My blood ran completely cold. She was lecturing me about financial contributions while actively spending my stolen equity. She was forcing me to act as the hired help at a party funded entirely by the identity theft she had helped cover up. I did not scream at her. I did not tell her that I had already seen the ledger. I simply kept my voice incredibly soft and told her I would be there early to handle everything. I hung up the phone and smiled at my computer screen. They were digging their grave deeper with every single arrogant demand. Saturday morning arrived with a clear, crisp sky. At exactly 10:00, I pulled my 10-year-old car into the service entrance of the Grand Oak Country Club. I wore a pair of faded jeans, a plain cotton shirt, and comfortable sneakers. I looked exactly like the hired help my mother expected me to be. The grand ballroom was a cavernous space filled with crystal chandeliers, polished hardwood floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a pristine golf course. It was a monument to wealth and status. And for the next 4 hours, I worked like a dog inside of it. I carried heavy boxes of imported orchids from the delivery trucks. I arranged the crisp white linen tablecloths over massive round tables. I folded 80 silk napkins into perfect swans because Susan had decided the catering staff was not doing it correctly. Every time my mother walked into the room, she found a new reason to criticize my work. She told me I was moving too slowly. She complained that my hair looked messy and reminded me to change into something presentable before the actual guests arrived so I would not embarrass Bradley in front of his important friends. I absorbed every single insult with a calm, serene nod. I placed the final silver forks on the head table, running my fingers over the expensive tableware. I knew something they did not know. I knew that at exactly 8 o'clock that morning, the senior fraud investigator at the bank had pressed a button on her keyboard. I knew that the fraudulent home equity line of credit, the account holding the stolen funds that were supposed to pay for this entire spectacular illusion, had been permanently and completely frozen. The money was gone. The bank had locked the vault. Every single crystal glass, every single imported flower, and every single drop of vintage champagne currently sitting in this ballroom was completely unpaid for. My family was throwing a massive 6-figure party with absolutely $0 to their name. The sheer magnitude of their impending humiliation was almost intoxicating to think about. As I was adjusting the placement of a massive hand-carved ice sculpture near the raw bar, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open. Chloe walked into the room. She was not dressed for setup. She was wearing a custom emerald green silk robe, holding a cup of premium coffee, looking like royalty inspecting her kingdom. She had just finished a private spa session upstairs. She walked slowly around the room, admiring the lavish decorations, running her manicured fingers over the expensive floral arrangements. She finally stopped next to me. I was sweating, my hands were dirty from unboxing supplies, and my back ached from lifting heavy crates. Chloe looked me up and down with an expression of profound, unfiltered pity mixed with deep condescension. She took a slow sip of her coffee and sighed. "You really are a lifesaver, Sarah," Chloe said. Her tone was dripping with fake sweetness that barely concealed the venom underneath. "Bradley and I were so stressed about the aesthetic details today. It is so nice to have someone like you around to handle the heavy lifting. I mean, we are paying an absolute fortune for this venue, but nobody pays attention to the details quite like family." I stood up straight and wiped my hands on my jeans. "It is a very expensive-looking party, Chloe. You both really went all out for tonight." Chloe laughed. It was a sharp, arrogant sound that echoed in the empty ballroom. "Well, you know Bradley. He does not do anything halfway. The budget for tonight is just over $42,000. But when you are building a massive corporate network, you have to project absolute success. You have to show people that you are a winner." She stepped closer to me, lowering her voice into a tone of mock sympathy. "I know that kind of money probably sounds completely insane to someone in your position. Bradley told me you are still driving that old economy car and living in that tiny apartment. He said you have been working at the same boring corporate job for years without taking any real risks." She paused, letting the insult hang heavily in the air. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel ashamed of my honest, hard-working life, while she stood there basking in the glow of stolen wealth. It was incredible how easily she spoke about a $42,000 budget, completely unaware that the very foundation of her bragging was built on felony identity theft. "Maybe if you took some risks like Brad," Chloe sneered, tilting her head and offering me a tight, condescending smile. "You would not be stuck balancing boring spreadsheets for the rest of your life. You might actually build something for yourself instead of just setting up parties for people who are actually going places." I looked at my sister-in-law. I looked at her expensive silk robe, her flawless hair, and the enormous diamond ring on her finger. I thought about the forged signature on the loan documents sitting in my attorney's secure safe. I thought about the federal investigators who were currently building a criminal case against the man she thought was a brilliant entrepreneur. She was standing in a room that was fundamentally built on a massive, terrible crime, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor was about to violently drop out from underneath her. The old Sarah would have felt a crushing wave of humiliation. The old Sarah would have looked down at her dirty sneakers, apologized for being in the way, and quietly retreated to the kitchen to cry. The old Sarah would have believed every single cruel word Chloe said, but I was not the old Sarah. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I did not flinch. I did not frown. I looked directly into Chloe's eyes and offered her the most genuine, radiant smile I had ever produced in my entire life. "You make a very good point, Chloe," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "Taking risks is certainly one way to build a life, but the thing about balancing spreadsheets all day is that you learn how to read the bottom line. You learn that numbers never actually lie. You learn that eventually every single debt has to be reconciled. No matter how much money you spend trying to project success, the true balance always reveals itself in the end. Chloe frowned slightly. The absolute serenity in my voice clearly confused her. She had expected me to cower. She had expected me to show visible jealousy or defensive anger. My calm agreement threw her completely off balance. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to deliver another sharp insult to regain her sense of superiority. But my mother abruptly marched over to us before Chloe could say a word. Susan was holding a clipboard and looking incredibly frantic. She pointed a sharp finger at me. "Sarah, stop standing around gossiping. The catering staff is having an issue with the seating chart for the VIP tables. You need to go into the kitchen and fix it right now. The guests are going to start arriving in exactly 3 hours, and you still need to go change into something that does not make you look like a janitor. Move." I looked at my mother. I looked at Chloe. I nodded my head in perfect polite submission. "Of course, Mom," I said quietly. "I will go fix the seating chart right now. I will make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be for tonight." I turned and walked toward the kitchen doors. I could feel their eyes on my back, judging my clothes, judging my life completely secure in their false superiority. They thought I was a pathetic, invisible workhorse. They thought they had successfully manipulated me into funding their lavish lifestyle and serving as their unpaid maid. They were absolutely certain that they held all the power in our dynamic. They did not know that the credit card on file with the venue director was currently pinging as a frozen asset in the federal banking system. They did not know that the $42,000 bill waiting to be settled at the end of the night was going to be rejected. They did not know that the beautiful, expensive trap they had built for themselves was already permanently locked from the outside. I pushed through the heavy kitchen doors and took a deep breath of the air mixing with the smell of roasting prime rib. I washed my hands in the industrial sink. I smoothed down my plain shirt. I had played the role of the victim perfectly. The final insults had been delivered. The disrespect had reached its absolute peak. There was nothing left to do now but wait for the sun to go down, wait for the champagne to flow, and wait for the venue director to walk out into the ballroom with a little black leather folder that was going to destroy their entire world. The sun finally set, and the doors to the grand ballroom officially opened. The Grand Oak Country Club was transformed into a monument of absolute suffocating arrogance. Guests began to pour into the room wearing expensive, tailored suits and designer evening gowns. The classical string quartet started playing a lively symphony in the corner, filling the air with an elegant melody that masked the toxic reality of the evening. I sat at my assigned seat at the very edge of the head table. I wore the same simple navy dress I had owned for 3 years. I kept my hands folded perfectly in my lap, watching the spectacular display of false wealth unfold right in front of my eyes. Bradley made his grand entrance a few minutes later. He walked into the ballroom with Chloe clinging tightly to his arm. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, flashing a practiced, brilliant smile at the crowd of 80 guests. He looked like a triumphant young executive who had conquered the entire corporate world. People clapped and raised their champagne flutes as he walked past their tables. He stopped to shake hands with his supposed investors' men in expensive watches who believed they were rubbing shoulders with a rising star. He kissed the cheeks of our extended family members. He soaked up their admiration like a dry sponge. I watched him accept their praise, knowing that every single second of his grand entrance was funded by a federal crime. The evening progressed exactly as my mother had planned it. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with premium appetizers and vintage champagne. The massive hand-carved ice sculpture of a luxury sports car gleamed under the soft chandelier light, slowly melting into a crystal basin. The floral arrangements on each table were towering cascades of imported white orchids and heavy red roses. It was a flawless $42,000 illusion. And I was the only person in the entire room who knew that the bank vault had already been slammed permanently shut. Dinner was served. It was a massive 5-course meal featuring dry-aged prime rib and imported seafood. I quietly cut my food, listening intently to the conversations happening at the center of the head table. My father, Richard, was seated directly next to Chloe's wealthy parents, William and Victoria. Richard was in his absolute element. He was swirling a glass of expensive scotch, leaning back in his chair, and loudly boasting about the family's incredible financial acumen. He told William that true wealth was about knowing exactly when to take massive risks. He bragged that he and my mother had always recognized Bradley's raw entrepreneurial genius and that they had structured their family investments to ensure his ultimate success. He spoke about real estate portfolios and leveraging assets as if he were a Wall Street titan, completely ignoring the fact that his so-called brilliant leverage was actually the stolen equity from my grandfather's lakeside cabin. Chloe's parents nodded with deep, respectful approval. They believed every single word. They believed they had married their daughter into a family of incredibly savvy, self-made millionaires. Chloe chimed in, holding up her champagne glass. She loudly bragged about the brand-new luxury sport utility vehicle Bradley had just surprised her with. She told her mother about the expensive leather interior and the premium sound system. She complained playfully about how hard Bradley worked, saying he was so dedicated to building his empire that he practically lived at his office. My mother, Susan, beamed with absolute pride. She looked across the table at Bradley with tears of joy shining in her eyes. She patted Chloe's hand and told her that behind every great man is an incredibly supportive family who is willing to sacrifice everything for his vision. I chewed my dinner slowly. I did not roll my eyes. I did not interrupt their glorious fabricated narrative. I just listened to them build their tower of lies higher and higher, knowing that the higher they built it, the more devastating the impact would be when it completely collapsed. When the dessert plates were finally cleared by the silent waiting staff, the room quieted down. The string quartet stopped playing. It was time for the speeches. Bradley stood up from the center of the head table. He picked up his heavy silver spoon and tapped it gently against his crystal champagne flute. The delicate ringing sound captured the immediate attention of the entire ballroom. 80 faces turned to look at my brother, waiting for his words of wisdom. Bradley adjusted his silk bow tie and offered the crowd a look of deep, manufactured humility. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Bradley began, his voice projecting smoothly across the quiet room. "They say your 20s are for learning, and your 30s are for earning. Reaching this milestone tonight makes me realize how incredibly blessed I am to be surrounded by such an elite, supportive group of friends, family, and investors." A ripple of polite, appreciative laughter moved through the guests. Bradley paused, letting the adoration wash over him. "I have to give a very special thank you to my beautiful wife, Chloe," he continued, gesturing grandly toward her. "You are my absolute rock. And to my incredible parents, Richard and Susan. You always believed in my vision. You always knew that my business would change the landscape. We are on the verge of a massive breakthrough, and tonight is just the beginning of our legacy." He raised his glass high into the air. The ballroom erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. My mother wiped a genuine tear from her cheek. My father patted Bradley heavily on the back, looking like the proudest man on earth. I sat perfectly still at the edge of the table. I watched my brother accept the applause of 80 people, while deliberately ignoring the sister sitting right next to him. He did not thank me for setting up the floral arrangements. He did not thank me for working the early morning shifts to pay his bills for years. He certainly did not thank me for the $150,000 of stolen equity that was currently funding the very champagne he was drinking. I was nothing to him. I was completely invisible. Chloe leaned over to me while the crowd was still clapping. Her breath smelled of expensive wine and pure, unadulterated entitlement. "You should really take notes, Sarah," Chloe sneered, keeping her voice low enough that only I could hear the poison in her words. "Maybe if you took some actual risks like Brad, you would not be stuck balancing boring spreadsheets for the rest of your life. It must be so completely depressing to just sit there in your cheap clothes and watch other people succeed while you do absolutely nothing with your life." I turned my head and looked directly into Chloe's eyes. I offered her a calm, terrifyingly peaceful smile. "You are absolutely right, Chloe," I said smoothly. "Balancing spreadsheets teaches you a lot about risk. It teaches you that eventually every single debt has to be reconciled. The numbers always catch up to you in the end." Chloe frowned, clearly unsettled by my calm and cryptic response. She opened her mouth to deliver another sharp insult, but she was suddenly interrupted by a shift in the atmosphere at the back of the room. I looked past Chloe's shoulder, focusing my attention on the large, heavy wooden doors near the kitchen entrance. For the past hour, I had been watching the venue's event director, Mr. Harrison. He had been standing near a discreet payment terminal, running the final administrative tasks for the evening. The venue policy required a final authorized swipe of the credit card on file to completely close out the massive event balance before the party officially concluded. I watched Mr. Harrison pick up the corporate credit card Bradley had provided. I watched him swipe it through the terminal. I saw him pause. I saw him look down at the small digital screen with a look of mild confusion. He pressed a few buttons and swiped the card a second time. He waited. The machine beeped. I could not hear the beep over the sound of the party guests talking, but I saw his shoulders physically drop. He turned and signaled for the general manager of the country club. The two men stood over the terminal, speaking in urgent, hushed whispers. The manager pointed at the screen. Mr. Harrison ran his hand over his face, looking suddenly very pale. I knew exactly what that small digital screen was displaying. I knew the red text was flashing a code 04. Suspected felony fraud. The bank had executed my request perfectly. The massive home equity line of credit, the account holding the remaining balance of my stolen future, was completely and permanently frozen by federal investigators. The money was gone. The card was completely dead. Mr. Harrison picked up a black leather billfold. He placed the declined receipt inside it. He took a deep breath, straightened his dark suit jacket, and began the long, agonizing walk across the polished hardwood floor. I tracked his every single step. The music in the background seemed to fade away. The voices of the guests became a dull, meaningless hum. I watched the venue director walk past the melting ice sculpture. I watched him walk past the tables filled with laughing, wealthy guests. I watched him march directly toward our head table, his face tight with professional panic and deep discomfort. The trap was closing. The heavy steel doors were swinging shut. Mr. Harrison reached the center of the head table. He stepped up directly behind Bradley's chair. Bradley was currently engaged in a loud, boisterous conversation with Chloe's father, laughing about a supposed golf trip they were planning to take next month. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and leaned down, whispering urgently directly into Bradley's ear. I watched my brother's face closely. I saw the exact fraction of a second when his confident, arrogant smile faltered. His eyes widened slightly. His broad shoulders instantly tensed. For one brief moment, the terrifying reality of his situation threatened to break through his carefully constructed facade. But Bradley had spent his entire life lying to escape consequences. He quickly recovered. He let out a loud, booming, completely fake laugh that echoed slightly over the quiet background music. "Oh, it is just a simple bank error," Bradley announced loudly, making absolutely sure that Chloe's wealthy parents heard him clearly. "You know how these ridiculous fraud alerts are when you make a large premium purchase? The bank software gets overly cautious and temporarily blocks the transaction. It happens to me all the time when I travel." Bradley reached up and took the heavy black leather billfold from Mr. Harrison's hands. He did not even bother to open it. He did not look at the printed receipt inside. Instead, with a theatrical, exaggerated sigh and a perfectly practiced roll of his eyes, he slid the leather folder directly across the white linen tablecloth. It glided past the crystal water glasses and the expensive floral centerpieces. It stopped exactly in front of my plate. "Sarah handles all the boring admin stuff for our family," Bradley joked to the watching crowd, waving his hand dismissively toward me as if I were a hired servant who had failed to do her basic job. "Be a dear and sort this out with the director, Sarah. Just put the remaining balance on your personal backup card for tonight, and my corporate finance team will reimburse you first thing on Monday morning." My mother immediately leaned forward, her tone sharp and intensely impatient. "Honestly, Sarah, hurry up. Do not keep the poor man waiting while you stare into space. You are ruining the elegant flow of the evening with your hesitation. Just pay the man, and let us get back to the celebration." The guests seated at the tables nearest to us chuckled softly. They looked at me with mild, condescending pity. They saw exactly what my family desperately wanted them to see. They saw the drab, obedient, invisible sister, who was only kept around to clean up the administrative messes so the important, successful people could continue celebrating their flawless, wealthy lives. I looked down at the dark leather billfold sitting on the white tablecloth. I reached out and slowly, deliberately opened it. The printed receipt inside was glaringly clear under the bright chandelier light. The total charge for the evening was $42,350. Stamped across the very bottom of the receipt in bold, unmistakable red ink was the reality they could no longer outrun. Declined. Code 04. Suspected fraud. I closed the billfold. I did not reach for my purse. I did not pull out my wallet or check my bank accounts. I simply placed both of my hands flat on the table, took a slow, deep, perfectly steady breath, and looked directly up at my brother. "I am not paying this bill, Brad," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not scream or shout, but the tone of my voice carried a cold, absolute terrifying finality that sliced directly through the ambient noise of the luxurious ballroom. Bradley's fake smile completely froze on his face. A murmur of genuine, uncomfortable confusion rippled rapidly through the guests seated closest to us. Chloe's parents immediately stopped smiling and leaned forward in their chairs, their brows furrowing in sudden deep concern. "Sarah, stop playing games right now," Bradley hissed through his gritted teeth. He leaned aggressively across the table, trying to use his physical presence to force my submission. The charming, wealthy facade was slipping away by the second, revealing the raw, frantic panic hiding underneath. "Just give the man your credit card right now. I said I will pay you back on Monday. Do not embarrass me in front of my investors and my family." My mother slammed her hand down hard on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. Her face flushed bright, angry red. "Sarah Elizabeth, you will open your purse right this second and take care of this bill. How dare you act in this incredibly selfish way at your brother's milestone celebration? You are causing a massive scene." "No, Mother," I replied, my gaze shifting steadily to her furious face. "I will not pay a single cent for this party." I picked up the black leather billfold. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I slid the heavy folder straight back across the smooth tablecloth. It bumped lightly against Bradley's crystal water glass, making a sharp, highly visible clinking sound. "You might want to read the name on that declined card, Brad," I said. I leaned forward just enough to ensure the entire head table and all the investors listening nearby heard every single word I spoke. "Because it is your name printed there. It is tied to your account. And then you might want to excuse yourself from this lovely party and call a very good criminal defense lawyer." The entire grand ballroom dropped into a suffocating, absolute dead silence. The waiters froze perfectly in place, holding their silver trays perfectly still. 80 pairs of eyes darted nervously between me, my furious mother, and my suddenly pale, sweating brother. The trap had finally snapped shut, and there was absolutely no way out. Bradley stared down at the black leather billfold sitting on the pristine white tablecloth. The confident, arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face all night completely vanished. He looked at the printed receipt, and then he looked at the credit card I had instructed him to read. I watched his eyes dart frantically back and forth between the plastic card and the bright red declined stamp printed across the bottom of the paper. It was his name printed on that card. It was a card tied directly to the fraudulent home equity line of credit he thought was completely invisible to me. I watched his chest rise and fall in quick, shallow breaths as the terrifying reality of his situation began to crush the air completely out of his lungs. The grand ballroom was so incredibly silent that I could hear the faint, steady dripping of the melting ice sculpture all the way across the room. 80 wealthy, influential guests were holding their breath, their eyes darting nervously between my suddenly pale brother and me. The clinking of silverware had stopped. The gentle classical music from the string quartet had abruptly ceased when the musicians noticed the heavy, hostile tension radiating from the head table. "Bradley!" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with sudden embarrassment. "What is going on? Why is your sister talking to you like that? Just give the venue director your black card and let us get back to the party. Everyone is staring at us." Bradley could not speak. His mouth opened, but his throat was completely paralyzed by absolute panic. He looked at our father Richard, who was gripping the edge of the dining table so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. My father realized that the financial safety net he had illegally built for his son was currently unraveling in front of his most important social connections. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed down the front of my simple navy dress. I did not rush. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for a few more agonizing seconds, ensuring that every single person in that massive ballroom was completely focused on what I was about to say. I looked directly at Chloe's extremely wealthy parents, who were sitting just a few feet away with expressions of deep, growing alarm. I looked at the men in expensive suits, who Bradley had introduced as his new business investors. "I am talking to him like this, Chloe. I said, projecting my voice clearly and calmly across the silent ballroom. Because the man you married is not a successful entrepreneur. He is a criminal. And the luxury lifestyle you have been bragging about to your parents all night is entirely funded by stolen money. A loud collective gasp echoed through the room. Several of Bradley's supposed investors immediately leaned back in their chairs, physically distancing themselves from the table. Chloe's mother brought a trembling hand to her mouth.
"Sarah, shut your mouth right now,"
my mother, Susan, hissed loudly. She jumped up from her seat, her face flushed with furious, desperate anger. "You are completely ruining your brother's milestone birthday. You are having some kind of jealous mental breakdown. Someone call security and have her removed from the building immediately."
"I am not going anywhere, Mom,"
I replied smoothly, holding my ground and refusing to let her familiar gaslighting silence me. And neither is Bradley, because the bank investigators already know exactly what he did. I reached down and picked up my practical leather tote bag from the floor. I unzipped the top compartment and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of official bank and legal documents. I held the stack up for the entire room to see. The bright light from the crystal chandeliers reflected off the stark white paper, highlighting the official seals of the bank's fraud division. For the past 14 months, I announced, turning my attention completely to the wealthy investors and Chloe's horrified parents. Bradley has been portraying himself as a brilliant self-made businessman. He has leased luxury vehicles, he has purchased expensive country club memberships, he has hosted extravagant dinners to court your investments. But Bradley's businesses have not generated a single dollar of actual profit in over a year. I walked slowly around the edge of the head table. I stopped directly between Bradley and my parents, placing myself firmly in the center of their shattered illusion. "He funded this entire magnificent charade by stealing my identity," I stated. My voice was absolutely steady, devoid of any tears or hesitation. 14 months ago, my father, Richard, used my old, forgotten email address to bypass bank security protocols. He conspired with a local insurance broker to create a fake notary public stamp. Together, they forged my signature on a highly illegal $150,000 home equity line of credit against a lakeside property that my late grandfather left solely in my name. Chloe let out a sharp, devastated cry. She dropped her champagne flute onto the table, shattering the delicate crystal glass and spilling expensive vintage wine across the white linen tablecloth. "Bradley, tell me she is lying," Chloe sobbed, grabbing his custom tuxedo jacket and shaking his arm. "Tell me you did not steal money to buy my car. Tell me you are really an executive." Bradley kept his eyes glued to the floor. He was physically shaking. He had spent his entire life escaping consequences because my parents always provided a soft landing pad for his failures. But there was no soft landing pad waiting for him tonight. There was only a sheer, terrifying drop into a federal criminal investigation. He could not charm his way out of a paper trail. I took the top document from my heavy stack and dropped it squarely onto the table in front of Chloe's father. He picked it up with a grim, severe expression, adjusting his glasses to read the fine print. "That is the official bank fraud investigation report," I explained to him, ensuring the surrounding investors heard the precise details of the crime. "It details the exact path of the stolen money. It shows the wire transfers moving directly from my stolen home equity account into Bradley's corporate ledger. It proves that every single penny he spent courting your family and your business partners was obtained through felony bank fraud. He used my financial future to buy your daughter's affection." Chloe's father turned hard and dark with absolute disgust. He dropped the paper back onto the table as if it were highly contaminated. He looked at my father, who was suddenly shrinking back into his chair. The arrogant boasting from earlier in the evening completely stripped away. "Richard," Chloe's father said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried across the quiet tables. "You sat at my table, drank my wine, and told me your son was a financial genius. You told me you managed a pristine family portfolio. You are nothing but a family of common thieves playing dress-up." My father opened his mouth, stammering wildly, desperately trying to form a coherent defense to save his crumbling social status. "Please, you have to understand, it is a massive misunderstanding. The property belongs to our family. We were just leveraging a family asset to create liquid capital. We were going to pay it back. Sarah is just a bitter, confused girl who does not understand complex financial strategies." "I understand complex financial strategies perfectly well, Dad," I interrupted, shutting down his pathetic attempt at gaslighting before it could even take root. I am a corporate accounts payable manager. I track missing money for a large corporation for a living. I know exactly what felony embezzlement looks like, and the federal banking investigators completely agreed with me when I handed them your forged documents on Tuesday morning. I turned my focus back to the venue director, Mr. Harrison, who was still standing rigidly behind Bradley, looking entirely stunned by the explosive family drama unfolding in his grand ballroom. Mr. Harrison, I said calmly, addressing the terrified employee, the reason that credit card declined for the $42,000 party balance is not a simple banking error. It is not a temporary hold. The card declined because I sat in a secure conference room with a senior bank fraud investigator this past Thursday. We coordinated a complete total asset freeze on all of Bradley's personal and business accounts. The freeze went into effect at exactly 8 o'clock this morning while you were setting up the ice sculpture. I paused, letting the devastating reality of my words sink deeply into the minds of everyone listening. The stolen money is permanently gone, I announced. Bradley does not have a single dollar left to his name. My parents drained their own savings to keep his previous business afloat last year, so they cannot help him. You will not be getting paid tonight. I highly suggest you call the local police department to report the theft of services because this family has absolutely no way to settle this massive bill. The venue director's eyes widened in sheer realization. He immediately signaled to the catering staff and the large security guards waiting by the heavy kitchen doors. The party was officially and disastrously over. The grand illusion had been permanently shattered. Bradley finally looked up from the floor. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, desperate hatred. He lunged out of his chair violently, knocking over his own crystal water glass.
You ruined my entire life!
Bradley screamed at me, his voice cracking loudly in the silent, echoing room. You planned this whole thing. You pretended you were going to stay quiet. You let me book this expensive venue and invite all these important people knowing you were going to cut off the money on the exact day of the party. You intentionally humiliated me in front of everyone I know. You ruined your own life, Bradley, I replied, refusing to take a single step backward from his aggressive posturing. You stole $150,000 from your own sister to throw a party you could not afford and to live a life you did not earn. You thought I was too weak to defend myself. I just balanced the ledger. I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 final thick white envelopes. I walked slowly over to where my mother and father were sitting. Susan was weeping uncontrollably now. The fierce, demanding matriarch who had spent the entire week treating me like a hired servant was completely gone. She was realizing that her entire social standing, her pristine suburban reputation, was being violently dismantled in front of the wealthiest people she desperately wanted to impress. She reached her shaking hands out toward me, trying to grab my wrists, trying to forcefully pull me back into the obedient, silent role I had played for 32 years.
Sarah, please stop this right now.
Susan begged, her voice a shrill, frantic whisper. We are your parents. We gave you everything. You cannot do this to your own family. We will lose everything we have. The country club will ban us permanently. Your father could actually go to jail for the notary stamp. Please, just tell them it was a massive mistake. Tell the bank you authorized the loan, and we will fix this privately.
You stopped being my family the moment you decided my future was nothing more than a disposable bank account for Bradley to drain.
I told her, my voice echoing with absolute cold finality. I placed the first envelope firmly onto the table, directly in front of my father. Then I dropped the second envelope directly in front of my weeping mother. Because the bank has officially declared the home equity loan entirely fraudulent, they are legally removing the catastrophic lien you placed against my grandfather's property. I explained slowly, making sure they understood the complete scope of their defeat. The cabin belongs solely to me again, completely free and clear of the massive debt you tried to bury me under. My parents stared blindly at the crisp white envelopes on the table, too terrified to touch them. Those are formal, legally binding eviction notices, I announced to them. For the past 10 years, you have treated my cabin as your own personal free vacation home. You have hosted your friends there. You have spent your summers sitting on my porch, drinking wine, and complaining about my lack of ambition, but you have never actually owned it. And as of this exact moment, your access is permanently and legally revoked. I pointed to the documents inside the envelopes. You have exactly 30 days to remove any personal belongings you left on the property, I stated. If you or Bradley ever set foot on my land again, my attorney has strict instructions to have you immediately arrested for criminal trespassing. My father buried his face in his hands, letting out a wretched, defeated sob that sounded entirely pathetic in the grand, luxurious room. The reality of his situation had finally, irreversibly crushed him. He had lost his fake wealth. He had lost his hard-earned social standing among his wealthy peers. He had lost his free vacation home. And he was about to lose his freedom the moment the police knocked on his door to ask about the forged notary public stamp. I looked away from my broken parents and scanned the crowd of wealthy guests. The partygoers were already standing up from their tables in a massive, chaotic rush. They were grabbing their expensive coats, pulling on their designer purses, and whispering furiously to each other, absolutely desperate to flee the ballroom before the police arrived to sort out the massive unpaid catering bill. Chloe's parents were physically pulling their sobbing daughter away from the head table. Chloe was looking back at my brother with absolute, unfiltered disgust, realizing that the glamorous, successful life she thought she had secured was nothing but a criminal house of cards. Bradley stood alone by his chair, watching his wealthy wife leave him, watching his investors walk out the door, and watching the venue. Security guards slowly close in around him to demand payment for the melting ice sculpture and the empty champagne bottles. I did not stay to watch the venue staff detain my brother. I did not stay to watch my mother cry over the shattered pieces of her perfect suburban illusion. I had successfully delivered the undeniable truth. I had legally cleared my name of their massive, fraudulent debt. I had finally permanently removed myself from their toxic, parasitic ecosystem. I picked up my practical leather bag. I turned my back on the people who had emotionally erased me for 32 years, and I walked confidently out of the grand ballroom, leaving them entirely alone to pay the devastating price of their own actions. The grand ballroom of the country club was completely paralyzed. The elegant classical music had long since faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. 80 of the most influential people in the city were staring at my family. The illusion of Bradley, the brilliant young executive, and Richard, the wise, wealthy patriarch, was shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. I stood at the edge of the table, watching the absolute destruction of their carefully crafted world. Chloe was the first to completely break the silence. She turned to her father, William. Her face was entirely drained of color, and her hands were shaking violently. "Dad, please tell me this is a joke," Chloe begged, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. "Tell me he did not steal money to buy my car. Tell me I am not married to a criminal." William did not look at his daughter. He was staring at my father Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. William was a man of old money and strict principles. He despised liars, and he utterly loathed men who could not provide for their own families. He slowly stood up from his chair, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with methodical, terrifying precision. "He is not joking, Chloe." William said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried to every single table in the vicinity. "This family is a complete fraud. Richard, you sat at my dinner table and drank my wine. You looked me in the eye and told me your son was a financial prodigy. You told me you managed a pristine family portfolio. You are nothing but a family of common thieves playing dress-up with stolen money." William turned to Bradley, who was physically shrinking back into his chair, sweating profusely under the harsh glare of the chandelier lights. "Do not ever contact my family again," William stated with absolute finality. "Do not call my office. Do not ask for my investors. If you ever come near my daughter after tonight, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic life behind bars." Chloe let out a loud, wretched sob. The glamorous, wealthy life she thought she had secured was completely gone. She had married a man who was entirely broke and actively facing a federal criminal investigation. She looked at Bradley with a mixture of profound horror and deep humiliation. She did not hesitate. She picked up her designer purse from the floor. She did not say a single word of comfort to her husband. She simply turned her back on him, completely abandoning the sinking ship. She walked rapidly across the polished hardwood floor, her heels clicking sharply against the wood. She followed her parents out of the ballroom, leaving Bradley entirely alone to face the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. My brother watched his wealthy wife walk out the door, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. He tried to stand up to follow her, but his legs seemed completely unable to support his weight. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. My mother, Susan, was hyperventilating. The fierce, demanding woman who had spent the entire week treating me like an unpaid servant was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, fragile woman, realizing that her pristine suburban reputation was dead forever. She looked wildly around the room at the guests, who were now quickly standing up from their tables. The wealthy friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress were grabbing their coats and heading for the exits, actively avoiding making any eye contact with her. "Sarah, please," Susan whispered frantically, reaching her shaking hands out toward me. "Please, you have to stop them. You have to tell everyone. This is a misunderstanding. We are your parents. We gave you everything. You cannot do this to your own family. We will lose all our friends. The country club will ban us permanently." I looked down at my mother. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no guilt.
"You stopped being my family the moment you decided my future was nothing more than a disposable bank account for Bradley to drain?" I told her, my voice steady and cold. "I am not saving you. I am simply balancing the ledger." The venue director, Mr. Harrison, stepped forward. He was flanked by 2 large, stern-looking security guards. He did not look intimidated by my parents' fake wealth anymore. He looked like a man who wanted his money. "Mr. Myers," Mr. Harrison said, addressing my father with a tone of absolute zero tolerance. "The credit card on file has been permanently declined with a federal fraud code. The remaining balance for this evening is $42,350. I need another form of payment immediately, or I am calling the local police department to report a massive theft of services." My father looked up at the venue director. His face was gray and slick with cold sweat. He stammered incoherently, trying to form a sentence. He patted his pockets as if hoping to magically find $40,000 in cash. "I do not have it," Richard choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "The accounts are frozen. I have nothing." "Then we have a very serious legal problem," Mr. Harrison replied, signaling to one of the security guards to make the phone call. I did not stay to watch the police arrive. I did not stay to watch my brother cry or my mother beg the venue manager for mercy. I had delivered the undeniable truth. I had formally handed them their eviction notices. I had completely shattered their parasitic hold on my life. I picked up my practical leather bag. I turned my back on the grand, beautiful table and the melting ice sculpture. I walked calmly and confidently across the ballroom floor. The few remaining guests parted ways to let me through, looking at me with a new, profound respect. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked out into the cool, crisp night air. As I walked to my modest 10-year-old car parked near the service entrance, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. It was a burden I had carried for 32 years, the constant suffocating need to please people who were entirely determined to misunderstand me, the endless, desperate attempts to buy love from a family that only viewed me as a convenient resource. All of it was completely gone. I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine. The sound was quiet and reliable. I pulled out of the country club parking lot, leaving the chaos and the flashing blue police lights far behind me. For the very first time in my entire life, I was completely and wonderfully free. 6 months can change absolutely everything when you finally stop carrying the dead weight of toxic people. The fallout from that night was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The police arrived at the country club and officially documented the massive unpaid debt. But that was only the beginning of their nightmare. The federal bank investigators moved forward with relentless speed. Bradley was formally indicted on multiple felony charges of bank fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. His highly expensive criminal defense attorney completely drained whatever small legitimate savings he had left. He is currently sitting in a small rented apartment, entirely alone, awaiting his federal trial. Chloe filed for divorce 3 days after the party, ensuring that her family wealth remained completely untouched by his criminal restitution orders. My parents faced their own devastating reckoning. The local police formally questioned my father about the forged notary public stamp. Robert Jenkins, the insurance broker who had faked the document, immediately panicked and turned state's evidence to save himself. He testified that my father had orchestrated the entire forgery. Richard narrowly avoided prison time by pleading guilty to a lesser charge of conspiracy, but the legal fees and the massive fines completely wiped out my parents' retirement accounts. They were forced to sell their beautiful, immaculate colonial home in the suburbs just to avoid total bankruptcy. The country club formally expelled them.
Their wealthy friends entirely abandoned them, refusing to associate with admitted criminals. Exactly 30 days after the party, I hired a private security firm to oversee the eviction at my grandfather's lakeside cabin. My parents had to drive up to the property in a rented moving truck and haul away their expensive patio furniture and wine collections under the watchful eyes of armed guards. They were permanently legally barred from ever stepping foot on the land again. I did not keep the cabin. It held too many memories of my childhood isolation and my family's relentless entitlement. Once the title was completely cleared of their fraudulent lien, I put the property on the market. It sold in less than 2 weeks for a substantial premium. I took the hundreds of thousands of dollars from the sale and invested it carefully, building a solid, bulletproof foundation for my own future. I am 32 years old now. I still work as a corporate accounts payable manager, but I no longer work extra hours just to avoid going home to an empty apartment. I moved into a beautiful, spacious loft in the city. I travel. I read. I spend my weekends exactly how I want to spend them. I never check my phone hoping for an apology that will never come. My family tried to reach out a few times in the beginning. Susan left crying voicemails begging for financial help with their legal fees. Richard sent long, rambling emails trying to justify his actions and demanding that we act like a family again. I never answered a single call. I deleted every single email without reading past the first sentence. You cannot negotiate with people who are fundamentally incapable of recognizing your basic humanity. I learned a very hard, very painful lesson over the past year. I learned that just because people share your blood does not mean they have your best interests at heart. I spent my entire life believing that if I was just obedient enough, quiet enough, and helpful enough, my parents would eventually see my value. I thought that by making myself small, I could somehow earn a place at their table. But I realized that love is not a transaction. You cannot buy love from people who view you as an automated teller machine. You cannot earn respect from people who require your absolute submission just to feel powerful. Setting a boundary is not a betrayal. It is survival. Walking away from people who actively exploit you is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. My family told me that I would be entirely alone if I stopped funding their lies. They told me I would be a villain for holding them accountable. They were completely wrong. I am not alone. I am surrounded by peace. I am surrounded by friends who value me for exactly who I am not, for what I can provide them. If you are watching this right now and you recognize yourself in my story, I want you to listen to me very carefully. If you are the reliable one, the quiet one, the scapegoat who is constantly expected to sacrifice your own happiness for the sake of keeping the peace, I need you to know that it is not your fault. You are not responsible for carrying the emotional or financial burdens of adults who refuse to carry themselves. You do not owe toxic people your future just because you share a last name. You have every right to protect your peace. You have every right to lock the door and walk away. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to save yourself? Let me know in the comments below. Do not forget to hit like, subscribe, and tell me where and what time you are watching. Until next time, remember your worth.